She was 3 signatures away from losing everything: her money, her company, and what was left of her dignity. The pen was already in her hand. The man across the table was smiling, the kind of smile that had nothing warm behind it. And then the doorbell rang. What happened in the next 4 minutes would expose a con artist, unravel a secret hidden for 30 years, and change 3 lives in ways none of them ever saw coming. This is the story of a woman who thought she had rebuilt her life, and a man who showed her she hadn't started yet. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Langley house on Maplewood Lane had not been touched in 11 years. That was easy to tell. The front porch sagged on the left side like it had grown tired of holding itself up. 3 of the shutters were painted a shade of green that had been fashionable once, probably before Victoria Langley was born. The gutter on the northeast corner had pulled away from the fascia board and dangled there at a lazy angle, moving slightly whenever the wind came through. The oak tree in the yard had grown into the power line in a way that made the electrician who came out for the inspection visibly uncomfortable. Victoria stood in the driveway on a Tuesday morning in early October and looked at it the way a surgeon looks at a patient before opening, not with affection, but with calculation. She had paid $412,000 for this property. She had paid it in cash, and she had told exactly no one why. Her assistant, a quick and permanently frazzled woman named Dara, had spent the better part of 2 weeks trying to get an answer out of her. "I just want to make sure I understand the logistics," Dara had said, standing in Victoria's downtown office with a tablet in her hands and a look on her face that said the logistics are not actually the problem. "You're going to be commuting from Maplewood Lane to the office during the renovation. That's 42 minutes each way in normal traffic." "I'm aware." "And you're doing this because I bought a house, Dara?" "Right." Dara tapped something on the tablet. "The board meeting on the 14th. I'll be there. And the quarterly earnings call? I'll be there for that too." Dara had nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided to stop asking questions but haven't actually stopped wondering. She pulled up the renovation contractor's profile on the tablet and held it out. Landon Pierce. He came highly recommended by 4 different clients in the historic district. His company does structural restoration mostly, old homes. Victoria glanced at the screen. A photo of a man in work clothes standing in front of a restored Victorian, square jaw, calm eyes. The kind of man who looked like he'd fixed something before you'd finished explaining what was wrong with it. "Fine," she said. "He's available to start Monday." "Good." Dara pulled the tablet back but didn't leave. Victoria could feel the question she wasn't asking. "I needed a change of scenery," Victoria said, without looking up from the contract she was reading. That's all. It wasn't all, but it was what she had. The truth was harder to say out loud. 18 months ago, Victoria Langley had signed her divorce papers in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee, surrounded by 2 attorneys and a mediator, and had walked out into a September afternoon feeling like someone had scooped out her insides and left the rest of her standing. The marriage had lasted 4 years. The last year of it hadn't really been a marriage at all. More like 2 people living in the same house and pretending to be fine for the benefit of the staff and the shareholders and whoever was watching. Marcus had not been a bad man. He had been a man who loved her the way some people love a rare object, with careful hands and a constant undercurrent of anxiety about damage. He had never understood that she didn't want to be handled. She wanted to be known. After the divorce, she had thrown herself into work with the kind of focus that bordered on self-destruction. She had taken Langley Ventures from a mid-sized regional investment firm to a company with assets under management that had nearly doubled in 18 months. She had been profiled in 3 magazines. She had been named to 2 industry lists. She had given speeches at conferences and smiled for photographs and answered questions about leadership with the polished ease of someone who had learned very early that being impressive was easier than being vulnerable. And then, on a Thursday night in August, she had sat alone in her downtown apartment with a glass of wine she hadn't poured because she wanted it, and she had looked around at the clean lines and expensive furniture and the view of the city she'd worked so hard for, and she had felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not sad exactly, not lonely exactly. More like outside of herself, like she had built a very convincing version of Victoria Langley and moved into it, and the real one was somewhere else, waiting. She had found the house on Maplewood Lane on a Thursday afternoon, through a listing her realtor had sent almost apologetically. It needs significant work. Not sure if this fits what you're looking for. Victoria had driven out to see it that same evening, alone, without telling anyone where she was going, and she had walked through the sagging front door into a house that smelled like old wood and dust and something she couldn't name, and she had stood in the middle of the empty living room with the late afternoon light coming through the dirty windows, and felt, for the first time in months, completely still. She had made the offer the next morning. She hadn't told the board, she hadn't told Marcus, she hadn't told her mother, who would have had opinions. She hadn't even told Doris, not really, not the part that mattered. Some decisions are not made with the mind. Landon Pierce arrived at 7:45 on Monday morning, which was 15 minutes earlier than the agreed time, in a truck that was clean despite being at least 10 years old. He was taller than he'd looked in the photo. Not dramatically, just the kind of tall that takes up space without trying to. He had dark hair that needed a cut and a flannel shirt under a canvas jacket and boots that had dried sawdust on them from whatever job he'd finished the week before. Victoria was in the driveway with her coffee when he pulled up. He got out of the truck and looked at the house for a long moment before he looked at her, which she noticed and, for some reason, appreciated. "Miss Langley," he said, walking toward her with his hand extended. "Victoria." She shook it. His grip was firm without being performative. "Landon." He turned back to the house. "How much do you know about what you're dealing with?" "I had a structural inspection done. The foundation is sound. The roof needs replacing in the next 2 years, but it's not urgent. The porch is the most immediate problem. The left side has settling issues." He nodded, still looking at the house. "The wiring?" "Partially updated in 2009. The kitchen and bathrooms were done, but the rest is original knob and tube." That made him turn to look at her. "So it's a fire hazard?" "Yes, that's why I hired a contractor." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "You've done your homework," he said. "I usually do." He walked toward the porch, and she followed, and that was how the 6 weeks began. She hadn't expected to like him. She had expected competent and professional and probably quiet. The kind of person you contract for a job and exchange pleasantries with, and then pay and move on. She had not expected the way he talked about the house, which was with the careful attention of someone who understood that old things have histories worth preserving. She had not expected his sense of humor, which was dry and rare and arrived without warning. She had not expected the steadiness of him, the way he explained things clearly without condescension, and the way he listened to her when she had questions, which was actually listening, not waiting to respond. On the third day, she arrived at the house to find him on the porch with a section of flooring pulled up, sitting back on his heels and staring at the substructure with an expression of mild annoyance. "Problem?" she said, setting down her coffee on the porch railing. "Nothing catastrophic. The previous repair in here, whoever did it, they sistered the joist wrong. I've got to redo about 12 feet of it. How much time?" "Day and a half, maybe 2. I'll make it up at the end." "You don't have to make it up," she said. "If the job takes longer because it's being done right, then it takes longer." He looked at her for a moment. "Most clients don't say that. Most clients probably don't want their porch to fall off the house in 3 years." "Fair?" He went back to looking at the substructure. "You know much about old houses?" "I know enough to know I don't know enough," she said. "My grandmother had one. I used to spend summers there." "Where?" "Near Hendersonville. It was built in the 20s. She refused to update anything. Drove the rest of the family crazy. But I loved it. The way it creaked when you walked through it, the way the light came in through the old glass." She paused, aware that she was talking more than she intended to. "You learn to read a house like that. What it sounds like when it's just settling versus what it sounds like when something's wrong." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "You do." She picked up her coffee and went inside to take a call, and she didn't notice until she was already in the kitchen that she was still thinking about the conversation. He had a daughter named Sophie. She learned this on day 8 when she came back to the house at 4:30 and found Landon sitting on the porch steps with his phone, talking in the careful and slightly overly patient voice that parents use when children are pushing back on something. "I understand that, but you still need to do the reading assignment before you can watch the movie. That's the deal we made." A pause. "I know you don't think that's fair. The deal's still the deal." Another pause, and then something shifted in his voice. Softer, less firm. Yeah, I'll be home by 6. We can figure out dinner together. He hung up and became aware that Victoria was standing nearby. Sorry, he said. My daughter. How old? 8. He stood up, pocketing the phone. She's got opinions. 8-year-olds usually do. Her teacher sent home a reading list. Sophie's decided that reading 4 chapters over 2 weeks is unreasonable. She made her case pretty thoroughly. He said it with the weary affection of someone losing an argument they're glad to be having. What's the book? Charlotte's Web. Victoria looked at him. That's a good book. It is. Don't tell her that. She laughed, a real one, not the professional kind, and Landon looked momentarily surprised, like he hadn't been sure she could do that. Her name's Sophie? Victoria said. Yeah. She didn't ask about Sophie's mother. The way he talked about managing dinner and reading assignments and the slight heaviness that lived somewhere behind his eyes when he thought no one was looking, it told her enough for now. By the end of the second week, they had developed a rhythm. He arrived early. She usually came by in the morning to check progress, and again in the late afternoon before heading back downtown. They would do a walkthrough, and he would explain what had been done and what was next, and somewhere in that conversation they would always end up on something else. A memory she'd mentioned, a question he'd asked, an observation that had nothing to do with joists or wiring or plaster. She told him one afternoon that she'd started a company at 26 with $30,000 she'd borrowed from her father, and that her father had told her she was throwing money into a hole, and that she had paid him back with interest in 14 months and framed the check stub. He told her one morning that he'd started doing carpentry because his hands needed something to do after his wife died, and that he'd been doing finish work for a construction company for 2 weeks when the foreman handed him a plane and told him to fix a door that was sticking, and that something about the feeling of the wood giving way under the blade had been the first thing in months that had made him feel like he was still inhabiting his own body. She didn't push on the wife part. He didn't push on the divorce part. It was, in its way, a careful friendship. The kind where you hand someone a piece of yourself slowly enough that you can still pretend, if necessary, that you didn't mean to. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks into the renovation, and they were looking for a period-appropriate light fixture for the dining room. The antique store on Lexington Avenue was the kind of place that smelled like old paper and metal polish, and the particular mustiness of things that had belonged to people who were no longer around to want them back. Victoria had come in alone, found 2 options that were plausible, and texted Landon a photo. He'd shown up 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes, with a small streak of paint on his forearm that he hadn't noticed. That one, he said, pointing without hesitation at the one she'd already mentally chosen. Why that one? The proportions are right for the ceiling height. The other one's too heavy. It would pull the eye down. He reached up to examine the fixture, testing the weight of it carefully. Where'd they find this? Estate sale in Black Mountain, said the woman behind the counter. A compact woman in her 60s named Marguerite, who had the sharp and delighted eyes of someone who enjoyed watching people fall in love with objects. Landon set the fixture down on the glass counter, and Marguerite looked at the 2 of them with the frank and unashamed assessment of someone who has spent decades watching couples come into her shop. Your wife has good taste, she said to Landon, nodding toward Victoria. There was a brief silence. Landon said, without any particular calculation, She does, doesn't she? And pulled out his wallet to ask about the price. Marguerite laughed, warm and pleased. Victoria smiled because the situation called for it. But something happened in the moment between the comment and the smile. A fraction of a second in which she didn't smile, in which she felt the word land somewhere below her sternum and stay there, warm and slightly alarming. Wife. The ease with which he'd said it, the way he hadn't stumbled or corrected or made it awkward. The way it had sounded from the outside like it fit. She bought the fixture. She made a joke on the way back to the car about how her husband might want to install it promptly so she could stop using a lamp from 2014, and Landon laughed, and that seemed to be that. Except that night, alone in her apartment, the word was still there. Wife. She sat with that for a while, and then she put it away with the same efficiency she applied to everything else she didn't know how to process. And she told herself it was nothing, which was the kind of thing you tell yourself when you already know it isn't. The problem with feelings you don't address is that they have a way of making themselves known through your behavior while you're busy pretending they don't exist. Victoria arrived at the house on Monday morning to find Landon already there, as usual, and she was fine. Completely fine. Until he looked up from the blueprint he was reviewing on the kitchen table and said, "Morning," in that ordinary, easy way he had, and she felt the same small, inconvenient warmth from Saturday and realized that fine was not quite the right word for what she was. "Morning," she said, and poured herself coffee from the thermos she'd brought and turned to look out the window at the yard where one of his crew members was doing something to the foundation drainage. "You okay?" he said. "Why wouldn't I be?" "You've got that face." She turned around. "What face?" "The one where you're thinking about 12 things and pretending to think about nothing." He said it without particular emotion, just as an observation, the way he might note that the baseboards needed a second coat. That, irritatingly, was worse than if he'd said nothing. "I'm fine," she said. "Okay." He went back to the blueprint. She stood there with her coffee for a moment, and then she said, because something in her needed to address it and get it over with, "The thing in the antique store was funny." He looked up. "Yeah?" "Marguerite's going to tell that story to her next 30 customers." "Probably." He watched her. "Did it bother you?" "A beat too long." "No," she said. "Why would it?" He held her gaze for just a moment, not long enough to make it a thing, but long enough that she knew he'd heard the pause. And then he nodded and went back to the blueprint. "Good," he said, "because Marguerite's going to think we're married until one of us tells her otherwise, and I figure we just let her have it." Victoria almost said something. She didn't know what. She picked up her coffee and her bag and said she'd be back after her 2 o'clock, and she left, and she drove back toward downtown with her hands perfectly steady on the wheel and her chest doing something complicated that she chose not to examine. He noticed. He wasn't sure what he'd noticed exactly. The pause. The way she'd said no about half a second after she should have. The fact that she'd brought it up at all when the easiest thing in the world would have been to let Monday be Monday and not mention Saturday. But he noticed. Landon drove home that evening thinking about it in the distracted, peripheral way he thought about things he wasn't ready to think about directly. The same way he'd been thinking about Victoria Langley in general for the past 3 weeks. He noticed things he wasn't trying to notice. The way she laughed when she was actually amused versus the professional version she used in business conversations, which were genuinely different sounds. The way she'd stood in the doorway of the future study for almost 5 minutes one afternoon, just looking at the empty room. And when he'd asked her what she was thinking, she'd said nothing in the tone that meant something. I don't know how to say yet. The way she talked about her grandmother's house, with a warmth she didn't let into the rest of her voice very often. He pulled into his driveway. He sat in the truck for a minute before going inside. He had not thought about a woman this way in a long time. He wasn't sure he had the right to, or the space for it, or even the vocabulary anymore. He'd been so thoroughly inside the life of a single father and a contractor, and a man who kept his head down and his hands busy, that the part of him that noticed things like this had gone a little rusty from disuse. Sophie was at the kitchen table when he came in, her math homework spread out in front of her, and a look on her face that indicated she had been waiting for him. "Dad," she said, "I need help with fractions." "Hi to you too." "Hi." She pointed at the paper. "Fractions." He dropped his keys and jacket on the counter and came to sit across from her. She had her mother's eyes, gray and direct, the kind that didn't look away from things. He had gotten used to that over the years, mostly. Sometimes it still surprised him. "Okay," he said, "show me where you're stuck." In the days after the antique store, something shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift that only exists in retrospect, that you can only name once you're past it. Victoria stopped lingering at the house. She still came twice a day, still did the walkthroughs, still asked smart questions, and made quick decisions. But the conversations that used to drift, the ones about grandmother's houses and difficult books and the texture of old wood, those went away, replaced by the cleaner, more manageable exchange of professional information. Landon let it happen. He figured she needed the space, and he understood the impulse. He was a contractor she'd hired. She was rebuilding something after a hard 2 years. Neither of those things made what seemed to be building between them a simple or obvious idea. He kept working. He replaced the wiring. He rebuilt the porch. He sourced a salvaged mantelpiece for the living room fireplace from a demolition site in West Asheville that matched the original style so well that Victoria had run her hand over the carved detail and said quietly, "This is exactly right." And he had felt unreasonably pleased by that and had gone back to work. His friend Marcus, the Marcus he'd known since high school, not Marcus the ex-husband who he'd only heard about secondhand, came over for dinner one Thursday night. They ate takeout pizza at Landon's kitchen table, and Marcus listened to him talk about the Maplewood Lane job for about 20 minutes before he set down his pizza and said, "You like her." "She's a good client." "I didn't say good client. I said you like her." Landon picked up his beer. "She's going through something. Lots of people go through something. You don't talk about them for 20 minutes with that particular look on your face." "What look?" "The one where you're talking about cabinets and wiring, and you look like you're thinking about something else." Landon was quiet for a moment. "Her divorce was recent," he said. "She doesn't need—" "You don't actually know what she needs," Marcus said, not unkindly. "You're guessing." "I'm being sensible." "You're hiding." Marcus took a drink of his beer. "Which is also one of your things. I'm just noting it." They ate in silence for a bit. "Sophie likes her," Landon said, which wasn't relevant and also wasn't true yet. Sophie hadn't met her, but he'd heard about her through conversation enough that he felt like Sophie already had a position on the subject. Marcus looked at him. "Sophie hasn't met her," he said. "No." "But you've talked about her to Sophie?" A pause. "I might have mentioned the job." "Right." Marcus smiled into his beer. "The job." Landon didn't say anything. Outside, the October wind moved through the maple in the front yard, and the kitchen light hummed, and somewhere upstairs, Sophie was doing something that involved a lot of stomping back and forth in the way of 8-year-olds everywhere. And the evening went on. Victoria found out about the article on a Wednesday morning, when Dara sent her a text before 7 a.m., which meant it was bad enough to justify breaking the unspoken rule about pre-7 contact. "You need to see this. Sending link now." It was a local blog, Asheville Buzz or something, the kind of outlet that had 300,000 followers and zero journalistic standards. The headline was in a font designed to feel urgent. "Langley Ventures, CEO, plays house. Who is the mystery man on Maplewood Lane?" The photos were candid and clearly taken by someone on the street. Victoria and Landon in the driveway, talking. Victoria and Landon on the porch with coffee cups. The one from the antique store, taken through the window, apparently. Landon reaching for the light fixture, her standing beside him, the framing of it making them look like exactly what Marguerite had thought they were. The article was written with the particular brand of insinuation that never quite says anything directly. It described Landon as an unnamed local contractor and Victoria as a recently divorced CEO whose judgment has come under increasing scrutiny by industry insiders. It quoted no sources. It implied everything. She read it twice, standing in her kitchen in her robe. Then she called her PR director, her attorney, and Dara, in that order. By 9 a.m., she was at the office, in a glass-walled conference room with 3 members of her board, 2 of whom were looking at their phones with expressions that told her they'd seen the piece. "This is nothing," she said, before anyone else could frame it. "It's a gossip blog. We don't respond to gossip blogs." "Victoria," started David Chen, her board chair, "there's nothing in that article. Photographs of me talking to my contractor. That's the entirety of the evidence. If we respond, we legitimize it." "It's not the photos," said Eleanor Parks, who had been on the board since before Victoria had taken over, and who spoke with the careful precision of someone who had been in these rooms a very long time. "It's the phrase judgment under scrutiny. Whether or not it's sourced, it's now in print. We need to think about how that lands with the Hendricks Group before the Q4 meeting." The Hendricks Group was the largest institutional investor in their portfolio. They were conservative. They cared about optics. Victoria sat with that for a moment. "I'll make a call to Richard Hendricks directly," she said, "before he sees it, if possible." "He's already seen it," David said. A beat. "Then I'll call him today." She kept her voice even. "This is a non-event. I intend to treat it like one." After the meeting, she sat in her office alone for 20 minutes and looked out the window at the city. She thought about the photos. She thought about the antique store and the way the article had framed what was, in reality, two people standing in a shop looking at a light fixture, and how little it took for something to become a story that belonged to other people. She thought about Landon and whether he'd seen it. She pulled up his number on her phone, held it for a second, put the phone down. She had work to do. Bob. He'd seen it. His sister had texted him the link at 7:15 with the message, "Okay." So who is the CEO girlfriend? Followed by 3 emojis that did not help. He'd read the article. He'd looked at the photos. He'd felt something complicated. Not exactly anger, more like the specific discomfort of watching something private be handed to strangers without your permission. And underneath that, something he didn't particularly want to examine. The word girlfriend in his sister's text sitting there, doing nothing, while he stood in his kitchen with a mug of coffee and pretended it meant nothing at all. He called Victoria at 9:30 when he was already at the house, and his crew was set up and working. She picked up on the second ring. "Landon, you saw the article?" "Yes." Her voice was that particular CEO voice, controlled, fronted, presenting fine. He'd learned to hear what was behind it. "I'm sorry," he said. "The photos. I should have—" "You didn't do anything wrong." Flat and certain. "Neither did we. We're not going to act like we did." "Okay." A pause. "How's the plaster work coming?" she said. He almost said, "That's not what I'm calling about." He didn't. "Good," he said. "The east bedroom wall needed more repair than I thought, but we're on track." "Good." Another pause. "I'll be by this afternoon." "Okay." He hesitated. "Victoria." "Yes?" "You're allowed to be annoyed by it. You don't have to already be over it." A silence. Longer than her silences usually were. "I'll see you this afternoon," she said. She hung up. He stood with his phone for a moment, looking out the front window at the yard where his crew was digging out the drainage line. You're allowed to be annoyed by it. He wasn't sure why he'd said it. It had just seemed like something that needed to be said. She came at 4:15. He was on the porch, checking the new boards for level, when she pulled up. She got out of the car looking the way she looked after a bad day at the office. Everything perfectly in place, which in her case was the tell. When she was relaxed, she got a little loose around the edges. Today, she was immaculate. He didn't comment on it. He showed her the porch work. She looked at it. She ran her hand along the new railing the way she always did when she was genuinely examining something. She said the wood grain was beautiful. "White oak," he said. "Wanted something that matched the original as close as possible." "It does." She was quiet for a moment, still looking at the railing. "I spoke to our attorney about the blog. She says we can pursue a defamation claim if there are material impacts on the company." "Are there?" "There might be." She finally turned and leaned against the railing, looking out at the yard. "The Hendricks group is conservative. They don't like noise." "I'm sorry," he said again. "Stop apologizing," she said. "You didn't write the article." "No, but I made the joke in the antique store." She was quiet. "If I'd thought, Landon." Her voice was careful and even, and had something fragile inside it. "You made a joke. It was a nothing moment in an antique store. The fact that someone chose to turn it into something else, that's not on you." She looked at him. "Or me." He held her gaze. "Is that what you've been telling yourself?" A pause that lasted a beat too long. "Yes," she said. "Is it working?" She looked back out at the yard. The maple tree was starting to turn, the leaves going yellow and orange at the edges in the late October light. The moment stretched. "Not entirely," she said. Quiet, almost to herself. He didn't say anything. He stood beside her on the new porch, both of them looking at the yard, and the light changed slowly around them, and the evening smelled like old wood and autumn and something almost ready but not quite. Neither of them moved toward the other. Neither of them moved away. The house on Maplewood Lane was beginning to look like itself again. Landon could see it now, the way it wanted to look, the way it had probably looked 60 years ago before time and neglect and wrong repairs had accumulated. The porch was solid, the wiring was clean, the plaster walls were repaired and smooth. The dining room light fixture hung in exactly the right place, throwing warm circles of light across the restored hardwood. He could see the house becoming itself. He was less sure about what else he was seeing. Sophie had finally asked him directly 2 nights ago while he was helping her with spelling homework at the kitchen table. "Is the lady whose house you're fixing nice?" "Yeah," he'd said. "She's nice. Do you like her?" "She's a good person, Soph. That's not what I asked." 8 years old. He really needed to work on his deflection. "She's going through a hard time," he'd said. "I'm fixing her house." "You can fix her house and like her at the same time," Sophie had said, with the breezy authority of a child who has not yet learned that most adult things are complicated for reasons that take years to explain, and she had gone back to her spelling worksheet. He had sat there for a moment, looking at his daughter bent over her work with her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and he had thought, I know you can." He just wasn't sure what came after knowing. The 6 weeks were almost up. The house on Maplewood Lane was nearly finished. The porch stood level and solid. The plaster was smooth. The dining room light caught the evening in exactly the way it should. The old oak floors had been refinished to a warm honey color that made the rooms feel like they'd always looked this way, like nothing had ever been wrong. And Landon Pierce stood in the living room doing a final check on the mantelpiece, running his hand along the carved detail the way he always did when he needed to know if a thing was right. And he thought about the woman who had bought this house without telling anyone why, and the way she'd stood in the empty study for 5 minutes looking at nothing, and the way she'd said not entirely on the porch in the October light when he'd asked if she was okay. He thought about a joke in an antique store that had turned into something neither of them had found a word for yet. He thought about how much easier it would be if things like this came with a blueprint. He pressed his palm flat against the carved wood of the mantelpiece. Yeah, he thought, this is right. He wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. Outside, the October sky had gone deep blue, and the maple in the yard was almost entirely gold, and the house on Maplewood Lane stood solid and warm in the early evening, looking like something that had been waiting a long time to be exactly this. The renovation ended on a Friday. Landon did a final walkthrough with Victoria at 3 in the afternoon. Every room, every repair, every detail. And she walked through her house the way you walk through something you've been waiting to see whole, quietly. With her hand trailing along the wall in the upstairs hallway, the way people touch things they're not sure are real yet. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The house said it for her. At the end of the walkthrough, they stood in the living room, and Victoria looked at the mantelpiece, the salvaged one from West Asheville, the one with the carved detail, and was quiet for a moment. It's right, she said. Yeah, Landon said. She turned to look at him. There was something in her face that she hadn't figured out how to close off yet, something open and real and slightly raw around the edges. And he looked back at her, and there was a moment, one of those moments that has a whole conversation inside it without anyone saying anything, and then she extended her hand. Thank you, she said, for the house. He shook it. Her grip was firm, the same as it had been the first morning. It's a good house, he said. Take care of it. I intend to. He drove home. He picked Sophie up from his sister's, made dinner, helped with homework, put her to bed. He went through all the ordinary motions of his ordinary evening, and he was fine, completely fine, except for the specific feeling he couldn't put a name to that sat in his chest the whole time. Not quite loss, not quite longing, more like the end of something that hadn't been allowed to finish. He told himself it was just the end of a job. He'd told himself things before. Victoria ate dinner alone that night in her newly restored dining room, under the antique light fixture that threw warm circles across the table, in a house that finally felt like somewhere she meant to be. She had a glass of wine and a book she didn't read, and the specific silence of a place that was hers, and she sat with that for a while. She thought about a lot of things. She didn't think about Landon Pierce. She was very deliberate about not thinking about Landon Pierce. She was very bad at it. By Sunday, she had convinced herself that the 6 weeks had been exactly what they appeared to be. A professional relationship that had been warmer than expected and was now complete. People made friends during renovations. People had conversations. People laughed in antique stores and stood on porches in the evening and said things that hovered in the air briefly and then dissipated because that was what things did. That was fine. She was fine. She threw herself back into work on Monday with a focus that even Dara noticed. You're doing the thing, Dara said, on Wednesday morning, appearing in Victoria's office doorway with a stack of folders and the expression of someone who has worked for a person long enough to know all their things. What thing? The thing where you schedule meetings until there's no air left in the day. I have a company to run. You always have a company to run. This is different. This is the thing you did after the divorce. Victoria looked at her over her reading glasses. Do you want to keep your job? I want you to eat lunch, Dara said, setting the folders on the desk. Your 2 o'clock called to reschedule. You have 90 minutes. Please eat something that isn't coffee. She left without waiting for an answer. Victoria sat in the resulting silence and looked at her desk, which was covered in documents and proposals and the normal machinery of a life she'd built to be very full, and she thought, briefly and against her will, about an empty study and a woman who'd stood in it for 5 minutes not knowing what she was thinking. She ate lunch. It didn't help as much as Dara had implied it would. It was during that same week, 11 days after the renovation ended, that Damien Cross first appeared. He came through a referral, which was how the most dangerous things usually arrived, wrapped in the warm endorsement of someone you trusted. The someone in this case was Preston Hale, a fellow investor Victoria had known for 6 years, who called her on a Tuesday afternoon and said, I want to introduce you to someone. Real estate, private market. I think you'll find it interesting. Preston was careful with his referrals. He didn't throw them around. Victoria took the meeting. Damien Cross arrived at her office on a Thursday at 2 p.m. looking like someone's idea of credibility. Not overdone, nothing flashy, the kind of expensive that wanted to look like it wasn't trying. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with silver at his temples and the relaxed confidence of a man who had sat across a lot of tables from a lot of people and had never been the nervous one. He had a good handshake. He made easy eye contact. He set his materials on the conference table with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this enough times that he didn't need to perform it. Miss Langley, he said, I appreciate the time. Tell me about the property, Victoria said. She never started with pleasantries in meetings. It made some people uncomfortable. Damien Cross didn't blink. 11 acres in the Swannanoa Valley, he said, sliding a prospectus across the table. Historic inn, built in 1887. It operated continuously until 2019 when the ownership group dissolved. The estate has been dormant since then. No maintenance, but the structure is sound. The land alone is valued at approximately $3.2 million. The total ask, including the building and restoration rights, is $4.8. Victoria looked at the prospectus. The photos were good. The property was genuinely beautiful. The kind of old mountain estate that didn't come available often. The kind that people with money and vision turned into something extraordinary. The investment structure, she said, private syndicate. 8 investors, including myself. Each participant contributes a defined share to a holding entity, which manages the acquisition and initial restoration phase. Returns come through either sale or revenue share once the property is operational. He leaned forward slightly. The reason I came to you specifically, and I'll be direct about this, is that we have one remaining position. The previous investor withdrew for personal reasons. We're at a point where we need to close within 45 days or the acquisition window lapses. Time pressure. She noted it. She didn't react to it. And Preston is in the syndicate, she said. Preston committed his position 14 months ago. He's been waiting for the right 8th participant. Damien smiled, easy, warm, calibrated. He thought of you immediately. He said you have an eye for properties with character. She looked back at the prospectus. I'll need full documentation on the holding entity, formation documents, operating agreement, the other investors' participation agreements, and independent financial statements for the property going back at least 5 years. Of course. And I'll want my own structural assessment before any commitment. Absolutely. I'll be in touch, she said, and stood, which ended the meeting. He gathered his materials without hurrying and shook her hand at the door, and she walked him to the elevator and went back to her office and sat down and looked at the prospectus again. $4.8 million wasn't a number that gave her pause. The investment, on the surface, was the kind of thing she would ordinarily find genuinely interesting, a historic property with real potential in a market she understood. The structure was unusual but not impossible. Preston's involvement was reassuring. She called Preston that evening. What do you think? He said. Isn't it something? It might be, she said. Tell me how you found Damien. Through the Whitmore Group. He's done 3 of these acquisitions in the last 4 years, all of them successful. He's meticulous. He is not someone who cuts corners. Did you verify that independently? A slight pause. I mean, I spoke with two of the other investors directly. They were happy with the returns. I'd like their contact information. Sure, I'll send it over. A pause. Victoria, I wouldn't bring you something I hadn't vetted. I know, she said. I'm vetting it anyway. That's why I thought of you, what? He said, and she could hear that he meant it as a compliment, and it was, and it also didn't mean she was going to take the word of a friend over due diligence. She was careful. She had always been careful. The problem with careful, sometimes, is that it's still possible to be wrong. She had her research team pull everything available on Damien Cross over the next week. What they found was consistent and clean. A real estate career going back 18 years, several well-documented acquisitions, a professional history that checked out at every turn. He had a website. He had a LinkedIn with genuine connections. He had a presence in industry directories. He had, as far as anyone could tell, exactly the biography he claimed to have. He sent the holding company documents promptly. His attorney was a real firm with a real address in Charlotte. The operating agreement was professionally drafted and appeared standard. Everything looked right. Victoria had been in business long enough to know that everything looking right was not the same as everything being right. But she also knew the difference between caution and paranoia, and the line between them got harder to hold when everything you looked at came back clean. She kept the process moving. She did not commit, but she kept the door open. Damien called her the following Tuesday to ask if she had further questions, and they talked for 40 minutes, and he was smart, genuinely smart, and knew the property well, and could answer her specific technical questions about the building's history without hesitation. He mentioned 2 other properties he'd passed on, and why, which was a thing that confident fraudsters sometimes did, and that confident legitimate operators also did, and she could not always tell from the inside of a conversation which one she was looking at. What she noticed and filed away without acting on it was this. Every conversation with Damien Cross left her feeling slightly reassured. Not dramatically, just slightly. Just enough. The way a good salesman always leaves you feeling, not pushed, not pressured, just quietly, incrementally more comfortable than you were before. She noticed it. She kept it in a folder in the back of her mind labeled, "Watch this." She had a lot of folders. What she didn't have was any particular reason to call Landon Pierce, which was why she couldn't entirely explain what happened on a Thursday evening, 2.5 weeks after the renovation had ended, when she was driving back from a site visit to a property in West Asheville. A different property, nothing to do with Damien Cross, just routine business. And she passed the turn for Maplewood Lane and, before she'd made a conscious decision about it, turned. She told herself she just wanted to see how the house looked from the outside. That was a reasonable thing for a homeowner to do. People drove past their own houses all the time. She told herself that right up until she pulled into the driveway and saw Landon's truck. She sat in her car for a moment. His truck was there because he was there. She could see through the front window that there was a light on inside, and she remembered, with the specific embarrassment of someone who had completely forgotten a practical thing, that she'd asked him 2 weeks ago to come back and adjust the fit on the back door, which had been hanging slightly off since the temperature dropped. He'd said he'd come by when he had a gap between jobs. This was, apparently, when he had a gap between jobs. She got out of the car. She could have not done that. She could have pulled back out of the driveway and gone home, and that would have been the sensible thing. She got out of the car. She let herself into the house with her key, and she could hear him in the back. The particular sounds of someone working, a creak of the door, a tool against wood, a low sound of concentration that she recognized and that did something unhelpful to her equilibrium. "Hello?" she called. A pause. Then, "In the back." She walked through the house. Her house, whole and warm and smelling like old wood and the particular clean smell of the work he'd done in it, and found him in the back hallway, crouched in front of the door, with a hand plane, adjusting the bottom edge with the careful, unhurried attention he brought to every problem. He looked up when she came in. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She leaned against the opposite wall. "The door's still hanging." "Was. Give me 5 more minutes." He went back to the door, drew the plane along the edge, tested the swing. "How's the house treating you?" "Well," she said. "Really well, actually. She stopped. She had approximately 6 things she could say about the house, and none of them were why she'd turned into the driveway. "The radiator in the upstairs bedroom is noisier than I expected." Old radiators are noisy. He tested the door swing again. Is it banging or hissing? More of a knock. Every morning around 6. That's just the pipes warming up. It'll even out once the house gets used to the season. He stood, tested the door once more. It swung cleanly now, and turned to look at her with the mild, assessing look she'd gotten used to. Was there something else? She was quiet for a moment. There's an investment opportunity, she said. I've been looking at it. A historic property. An old inn in the Swannanoa Valley. He waited. The structure came through a private syndicate. The investor coordinating it is someone I hadn't worked with before. She crossed her arms loosely. Everything checks out. My research team went through everything they could find. His documentation is clean. His references are solid. But, Landon said. I didn't say but. You stopped mid-sentence. That's where the but goes. She almost smiled. Every conversation I have with him leaves me feeling better about the deal than I felt going in. By a small amount. Every time. Landon was quiet for a moment. He turned and started gathering his tools, unhurried, deliberate, the way he always moved. That bothers you. It's notable. What does your gut tell you? My gut isn't a due diligence process. No, he said. But you've been in business for how long? What does your gut tell you? She looked at him. It tells me something is slightly off, but it can't find where the off is. He picked up his bag. Who referred him to you? A colleague I trust. Preston Hale. He's been in the syndicate for over a year. And Preston trusts him? Apparently. Landon nodded slowly. Not agreement. More like he was turning something over. What's the entry amount? The position is approximately $600,000. He looked at her. Not at the number. At her. How quickly does he need an answer? He's given me 45 days from initial meeting. About 3 weeks remaining. Landon set his bag down on the floor and leaned against the wall across from her, which meant they were both leaning against opposite walls of her back hallway like two people having a conversation in a diner booth. Victoria, the thing you just described, where every conversation makes you feel a little better, a little more comfortable, a little more like the decision has already been made. That's a technique. That's not a coincidence. She looked at him steadily. I know that. That's why I'm... She stopped. Why you're what? A pause. I don't know why I'm telling you this. He was quiet. The house settled around them. One of those small sounds of old wood contracting in the cold. Maybe because I'm not in your world, he said. I don't have a position on it. I'm not going to tell the board. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. That's probably it. He picked up his bag again. Trust the thing that's bothering you, he said. You found it. Don't talk yourself out of it because everything on paper looks right. He moved toward the hallway. Papers can be made to look right. She turned as he passed. How do you know that? He stopped. Thought for a second. I had a guy subcontract tile work for me once. References were great. Did 3 jobs where everything looked perfect. He shook his head. 4th job, a bathroom in a house in Kenilworth. He'd used the wrong adhesive under every single tile. Looked perfect on top. Underneath it was already failing. He met her eyes. The surface is the easiest part to get right. She held that. He walked down the hall toward the front door, and she followed, and she held the door as he went out, and he turned on the porch. Look into the previous deals, he said, not through his documentation, through whoever you can find that was actually involved. I know how due diligence works, she said. I know you do. He said it without apology. I'm just saying it out loud. He went down the porch steps and got into his truck, and she stood in the doorway of her house and watched him pull away, and she stood there for a moment after the truck was gone, looking at the empty street in the late November dark. She went inside. She called her attorney that night and asked her to find independent verification of the previous Damien Cross acquisitions, not through his documentation, but through the actual parties involved. She told herself it was because of due diligence. She did not examine the other part too closely. The next morning, Damien Cross called her. He was warm, easy, unhurried, the way he always was. He asked how her review was progressing. He mentioned that he'd just spoken with Preston. He noted gently that one of the other investors had been asking about the timeline. that 45 days was already something of a courtesy he'd extended given the situation. "I appreciate the patience," Victoria said. "I'm still in review." "Of course." A pause. "I wonder if it would help to meet at the property itself. Sometimes seeing a place in person moves things from theoretical to real. I could arrange access this weekend, if you're free." She considered it. "I'll let you know." After she hung up, she sat at her desk and thought about what Landon had said. Every conversation makes you feel a little better, a little more comfortable, a little more like the decision has already been made. She replayed the last 4 minutes of the call she'd just finished. She had, by the end of it, been slightly more inclined towards saying yes to a weekend site visit than she'd been at the beginning, by a small amount. She did not call him back to schedule it. Instead, she called Dara in and told her to look up every publicly accessible record she could find connected to the 3 acquisitions Damien had referenced in his materials, not through his documentation, through public filings, news archives, property records. Dara looked at her. "Is something wrong with the deal?" "I don't know yet," Victoria said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Dara pulled the door most of the way closed, then stopped. "Does this have anything to do with the contractor?" Victoria looked at her. "Why would this have anything to do with the contractor?" "It doesn't," Dara said, in the tone of someone who absolutely did not believe what she was saying. She pulled the door closed. Victoria turned back to her computer. The gossip blog was still technically live, still there, indexed, findable if you searched her name. The retraction they'd demanded hadn't come through yet. Her PR director had sent 2 follow-up emails. The attorney had sent a letter. The blog's editor had responded vaguely and then gone quiet. She pulled up the article and looked at the photos again, herself and Landon in the driveway. The antique store, the light coming through the window, the 2 of them in the frame. She looked at the photo for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she closed the tab and went back to work. It was the following week, 4 weeks after the renovation ended, when the story broke publicly in a way that changed everything. Not the Asheville Buzz story. A different one. Dara came into her office on a Tuesday morning without knocking, which she only did when something needed to happen immediately, and set her tablet on the desk with a news article pulled up. "The Hendricks Group," Dara said. "Read the 3rd paragraph." It was a financial industry news site, real journalism, credentialed reporters. The article was about a fraud investigation that federal authorities had quietly opened 8 months ago into a real estate syndication scheme operating across 3 southeastern states. The scheme involved, according to the article, a pattern of targeting high net worth individuals during or after personal financial transitions, divorces, inheritances, major life events. The perpetrator would establish legitimacy through carefully constructed documentation and genuine professional references before requesting a large deposit into a holding entity. Once the deposit was transferred, the entity would be dissolved and the money moved through a series of shell companies. The article did not name any specific targets or suspects. The investigation was ongoing. Victoria read it twice. Then she pulled up her file on Damien Cross. Then she sat very still at her desk for a moment. Recently divorced. She checked the box. High net worth individual. Check. Personal transition. Check. Referred through a trusted contact. Check. Large deposit into a holding entity. The position in the syndicate was $600,000, wired to the holding company upon commitment. She was not a suspicious person by nature. She was a careful one. And careful people, when they see a pattern this clear, do not dismiss it because the surface looks clean. She called her attorney. "Emily," she said when she picked up. "The Damien Cross matter. I need you to treat it as an active legal concern, not a precautionary review. I want a complete independent investigation." "What happened?" "Read today's Financial Newswire article on the Southeastern Real Estate Fraud Probe." A pause. She could hear Emily pulling it up. "Oh," Emily said. "Yes," Victoria said. "I need it fast." What happened over the next 8 days would later feel, in retrospect, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, each piece tipping into the next with an awful, unstoppable logic. Victoria's attorney found the first inconsistency on day 3. One of the investors Damien had cited as a reference in his materials was a real person, a legitimate businessman in Charlotte, who had no knowledge of any syndicate and had never met Damien Cross. His name had been used without permission. His supposed participation, documented in the materials Victoria had been handed, was fabricated. They found the second inconsistency on day 5. One of the 3 previous acquisitions Damien had described could not be verified through any independent public record. The property existed, the sale had occurred, but the investor group Damien claimed to have organized had no documentable existence. The returns he'd described had no paper trail outside of documents he had provided himself. By day 7, Emily had contacted a colleague in Charlotte who mentioned, carefully and off the record, that the federal investigation on the financial newswire was directly connected to a series of complaints filed by women across 3 states over a 4-year period. Women who had been through divorces. Women who had been referred to a man named, in those complaints, by various aliases, but whose description, operating method, and biographical details matched Damien Cross with a precision that left no meaningful room for coincidence. Victoria sat in Emily's office on a Thursday afternoon and listened to all of this, and she was very quiet. "How close did he get?" Emily asked. "I hadn't signed anything," Victoria said. "I was still in review." "That's very good, Victoria." "Yes," she said. "It is." She said it evenly. She held herself evenly. She was very good at holding herself evenly. And underneath it, something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite fear, something that lived between them, something more like the cold and clarifying feeling of understanding fully what had nearly happened and exactly how it had been arranged. He had picked her deliberately, timed his approach, used Preston, genuinely, innocently, unwittingly complicit Preston, as a human key to her door. He had sat across her conference table and looked at her with easy eyes and calibrated warmth, and he had been running a calculation the entire time. She drove home that evening in the kind of silence that isn't quiet. She sat in her car in the driveway of the house on Maplewood Lane for 2 minutes before she went inside. The porch light was on, she'd put it on a timer. The house looked exactly like itself, solid and warm in the November dark. She went inside. She poured herself a drink she didn't particularly want and stood in the kitchen and thought about Landon in the back hallway, leaning against the wall saying, "Trust the thing that's bothering you." She hadn't signed anything. She stood in the kitchen for a while. Then she did something she had been not doing for 4 weeks. She picked up her phone and she called him. He answered on the 3rd ring and there was background noise, dishes, Sophie's voice somewhere farther off. "Victoria?" He sounded surprised but not alarmed. "Everything okay with the house?" "The house is fine." She stopped. She hadn't planned what to say past the calling part. I found something. About the investment. About the man behind it." A pause. She heard him say something to Sophie. "Give me a minute, Soph." And then the background sound receded and he was in a quieter space. "What did you find?" he said. She told him. All of it. The inconsistencies, the fabricated references, the pattern in the federal investigation, what her attorney had laid out. She told him without editorializing, just the facts in order, the way she would have told her attorney, except that she was standing in her kitchen with her drink on the counter untouched, and her voice doing something she couldn't entirely control toward the end of it. When she finished, there was a silence. "You didn't sign," Landon said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Good." A pause. "Are you okay?" And there it was. The question she'd been not asking herself for 2 days, the one that had been sitting under every meeting and every conversation and every moment of careful, forward-facing composure. She stood in her kitchen and held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm angry," she said. Yes, I'm okay. I'm angry." "That makes sense," he said. "Not, I'm sorry," which would have been the automatic thing, the reflex thing, just, that makes sense. Like her anger was the appropriate and logical response to a real thing, which it was, and which somehow no one had just said like that yet. "The meeting is still on," she said. "He's expecting me to give him an answer this week. He's pushing for it." "Don't warn him," Landon said. "Immediate. Clear." "Not yet. Your attorney needs to talk to whoever's running the investigation before any of that moves." "I know." She did know. "Emily is making that call tomorrow." "Good." She stood there. The house was quiet around her. The antique light in the dining room was on, throwing its warm circles. "I don't know why I called you," she said. Honest, a little tired. "Yeah, you do," he said. Quiet. No edge to it. She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "I think I do." Neither of them said anything for a beat. "How's Sophie?" she said. A small change in his voice, warm, involuntary. "She's reading Charlotte's Web." Finally? Finally. She's on chapter 6, and she's pretending she doesn't care about it, and I came in last night and she'd been crying and wouldn't admit it. Victoria laughed. The real kind, the one she couldn't plan. "Don't tell her it gets worse." "Oh, she's going to be devastated." He sounded almost happy about it, in the way of parents who love watching their children feel things. "She's going to pretend she's fine." "She's got that from somewhere." A pause. "Probably," he said, gently. She picked up her drink, put it back down. "I should let you go." "Call me when you know more," he said. "About the other thing." "I will." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved through the maple in the yard. The porch light was on. The house was warm. She had not signed the papers. She thought about Damien Cross sitting in her conference room with his easy eyes and his calibrated warmth, and she thought about what he'd thought when he looked at her, what calculation he'd made, what box he'd checked, how neatly she'd fit into whatever template he'd built out of other women's losses. She thought about how close she'd come. She picked up her drink and carried it to the living room and sat down on the couch and looked at the mantelpiece, the salvaged one with the carved detail, exactly right. And she sat with all of it for a while. The anger, the relief she hadn't let herself feel yet, the specific feeling of having almost been someone else's story. She was not going to be someone else's story. She was very certain about that. The meeting with Damien Cross was still on the books. He expected her answer at the end of the week. She was going to give him one. Emily made the call on Friday morning. The contact at the federal level was a woman named Agent Sandra Reyes, who worked out of the Charlotte field office, and who, according to Emily, had listened to everything with the careful, non-committal attention of someone who had been doing this long enough not to react to anything too quickly. She had asked 2 specific questions: whether Victoria had signed any documents and whether any money had been transferred. And when Emily said no on both counts, there had been a silence on the line that felt, Emily said, like relief. "She wants to talk to you directly," Emily told Victoria. "Monday morning. She'll come here." "Fine," Victoria said. She also said, and I want you to hear the exact phrasing here, that you should proceed as normally as possible with Damien Cross until she's had that conversation with you. Don't cancel the meeting. Don't warn him. Don't do anything that changes the pattern he's expecting. "I understand." "Victoria," Emily paused. "She said this is a significant development in their investigation. You're not the first, but you may be the one who helps them close it." Victoria absorbed that. Not the first. She let that sit in the room for a moment. The women before her, whoever they were, whatever they'd lost. "Tell her I'll be ready Monday," she said. She hung up and sat at her desk and looked at her calendar, where Friday afternoon still had Damien Cross penciled in. He'd called Thursday to confirm. Warm, easy, 2 minutes of conversation that had done its usual subtle work on her confidence in him before she'd reminded herself what the warmth was for. She kept the appointment on the calendar. She did not call Landon immediately, even though some part of her wanted to. She sat with that want for a moment. The wanting itself, the fact of it, the way it had become a kind of reflex over the past weeks. She had spent 2 years very deliberately not needing people in the particular way that made you reach for your phone when something happened. She had been good at it. She was becoming less good at it. She let herself acknowledge that privately without making it into anything more than it was. Then she picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. "Hey." "Emily spoke with the federal agent this morning," she said. "They want to meet Monday. She confirmed what we suspected. There are other cases." A pause. "How many?" She didn't say specifically, enough that they have an active investigation. "Are you keeping the meeting with him?" "Friday afternoon, yes. Emily said not to change anything." "Good." She heard him exhale. "Are you going to be okay doing that?" "Sitting across a table from someone I now know is running a fraud operation and pretending I don't know?" She paused. I've had quarterly earnings calls with board members who thought the company was going under. I'll manage. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. She was quiet for a second. But it's the same skill. He was quiet on the other end. She could hear the faint ambient sound of wherever he was. Outdoor air, maybe. A job site. If you want someone there, he said carefully, not at the meeting, just afterward. She held the phone, looked at the wall of her office. I'll call you, she said. Okay. She hung up and she sat with the warmth of that for exactly 30 seconds before she put it away and went back to work. The Friday meeting with Damian Cross was at 2 p.m. He arrived the way he always arrived, precisely on time, unhurried, the expensive but not flashy version of himself. He shook her hand. He sat across from her in the conference room. He set his materials on the table with that same practiced ease. He asked if she'd had a chance to look at the full prospectus again. He asked if she had any remaining questions. She watched him the way you watch something you've finally understood. What she saw was the performance of it, the calibration she now recognized for what it was. The warmth was a tool. The patience was a tool. The way he asked questions as though her answers genuinely shaped his thinking, that was a tool. All of it deployed with the unconscious fluency of someone who had done it so many times that it had become natural, which in a way was the most disturbing part. He wasn't straining, he was just being himself, and his self was built entirely for this. I've reviewed everything thoroughly, she said. And? He smiled, patient, ready. I have a few remaining questions about the holding entity's dissolution provisions. She asked 3 technical questions that she already knew the answers to. He answered them smoothly, confidently, with the kind of detail that sounded specific enough to be real and that she now understood was constructed. She nodded. She made notes. She thanked him for his thoroughness. I'd like until the end of next week to give you a final answer, she said. The smallest thing moved across his face. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. A micro-adjustment. I appreciate the care you're taking, he said. I want to be transparent with you. 2 of the other investors have been asking about timeline. We're approaching the window. I understand the timeline, she said. I'm asking for 1 more week. He looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. Of course, he said. He gathered his materials. He shook her hand at the door. He told her he looked forward to her call. She walked him to the elevator. She went back to her office. She sat down. Her hands were steady. Her voice had been steady throughout. Her breathing was even. She was absolutely furious. Not the hot kind of fury. The cold kind. The kind that doesn't shake or snap, that just settles in and burns low and even and doesn't go out. She sat with it. She thought about the women before her. She thought about the divorce that had made her, in someone's calculation, a target. She thought about what he would have done with $600,000 of her money, how fast it would have moved, how many layers it would have passed through, how little of it would ever have come back. She thought about the moment she'd almost not trusted the thing that was bothering her. She called Landon. How'd it go? He said. He knew about the meeting. She'd told him the time. He's good, she said. He's genuinely good at it. Are you okay? I'm angry. I know. A pause. Same kind as before or different? She thought about it. Colder, she said. Yeah. He sounded like he understood that. Where are you? Office. Don't stay there alone for 4 hours, he said. Go home, or... He stopped. Or, she said. Sophie's been asking about the house on Maplewood Lane, he said. She's been asking since I mentioned it. She wants to see the light fixture. Victoria paused. She wants to see the light fixture. She's 8. She has opinions about antique light fixtures, apparently. I don't know. She takes after someone. A beat. We could come by. I could bring dinner. If you don't want to be alone in your office, and you don't want to be alone in your house either. Victoria sat with that for a moment. The offer was simple and ordinary and meant everything it appeared to mean, and she was aware of that and aware that the awareness itself was something she needed to think about. Okay, she said. Yeah? Yes. Come by at 7. I'll make sure there's something to drink that isn't work. She heard the smile in his voice before he said anything. See you at 7. She arrived home at 6, which gave her an hour, and she did not spend it the way she'd expected. She didn't change clothes, didn't fuss with the house, didn't stand in the kitchen trying to figure out what the evening was. She made herself a cup of tea, and she sat in the living room in front of the fireplace, and she let herself be still for a while. The house was quiet and warm. The mantelpiece looked right. The light from the dining room came through the doorway in the particular warm way she'd come to associate with home, which was a word she'd been cautious about for a long time, and which seemed to be applying itself to this place without asking her permission. They arrived at 7:10, which was close enough to on time. She opened the door and Landon was there with a brown paper bag that smelled like Italian food, and beside him was Sophie, who was smaller than Victoria had expected, small in the specific, vivid way of children who have very large presences, with gray eyes that looked at Victoria with the frank and immediate assessment of someone who had formed a prior opinion and was now checking it against the evidence. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," Victoria said. Sophie looked past her into the house. "Is that the light?" Victoria looked up at the dining room fixture, visible from the doorway. "That's it," she said. Sophie walked past her into the house without being invited, which Landon started to correct. "Soph," and Victoria said, "It's okay," at the same time, and Landon stopped. They looked at each other briefly. He had a slightly tired look that she recognized as end-of-week parenting. "Come in," she said. He came in and handed her the bag, and they stood in the entry for a moment while Sophie stood in the dining room doorway, staring up at the light with what appeared to be genuine and total absorption. "She was not kidding about the light fixture," Victoria said, low. "She's been like this since I described it," Landon said, same tone. "I showed her a photo, and she said it looked like something from a story." Victoria looked at Sophie, small and intent and illuminated from above by the fixture in question, and something moved in her chest that she didn't try to name. "It does," she said. They ate at the dining room table, take-out pasta from a place on Marymount Avenue that Landon apparently knew well enough to order without looking at the menu. And Sophie talked about school with the stream of consciousness energy of a child who has been saving things up, the reading homework and the fractions, and a girl named Marcy who had said something at lunch that Sophie was still processing, and Landon listened and asked the right questions and corrected her when she interrupted and let her interrupt once more before he corrected her again. And it was all so ordinary and unrehearsed that Victoria sat across from it feeling slightly undone. Not in a bad way. In the way of someone who has been very composed for a very long time walking into a room where composure isn't required and feeling the effort of it suddenly become visible. "Dad says you run a company," Sophie said, at some point, turning her gray eyes on Victoria with the directness that seemed to be a family trait. "I do," Victoria said. "What kind?" "Investment. We help other companies grow." Sophie considered this. "Do you like it?" It was the kind of question children asked that adults had largely stopped asking because the answer had stopped seeming relevant. Victoria sat with it for a second. "Most of the time," she said. "Some days it's hard." "Dad says most good things are hard sometimes." "Your dad is right about that." Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her pasta. Landon caught Victoria's eye across the table, and there was something in his face. Quiet, a little surprised, a little something else, and she looked away first because she needed to. After dinner, Sophie asked if she could look at the rest of the house, and Landon said only if Victoria didn't mind, and Victoria said she didn't mind, and so Sophie made a slow circuit of the downstairs with the careful interest of someone taking inventory, stopping at the mantelpiece for a long time, and running her finger along the carved detail the same way Victoria had the day she'd seen it. "Dad made this?" she said. "He found it," Victoria said, "and installed it." Sophie looked at Landon. "It's good." "Thanks, Soph." "The carving part is good, not just the installing." "I know, I said thanks." Victoria put her hand over her mouth briefly. They left at 9 because it was a school night and Sophie had reached the specific stage of tiredness where she was visibly running on fumes but would not admit it. She put on her jacket at the door and looked at Victoria with those gray eyes. "Can I come back?" she said. Victoria looked at her. "Yes," she said. "You can come back." Sophie nodded like this had been the correct answer and went out to the car. Landon stood in the doorway for a moment. "Sorry if she was a lot," he said. "She wasn't. She talked for 2.5 hours. I know. I liked it." Victoria looked at him. Thank you for coming. I needed... She stopped. This. I needed this. He looked at her for a moment. His face did something she couldn't quite read, or could, but wasn't ready to act on. Get some sleep, he said. Monday's going to be a long day. I know. He went down the porch steps. She stood in the doorway and watched them drive away, and then she went back into her house, and she sat down, and she was quiet for a long time. She was very afraid of what she was starting to feel, not because it was bad, because it was real, and real things could break in real ways, and she had been broken before in ways that had taken a long time to come back from. She sat with that. Then she went to bed, and she slept better than she had in weeks. Monday arrived the way important days do. Ordinary on the outside, weight in the air. Agent Sandra Reyes was not what Victoria had expected. She was in her early 50s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the unhurried manner of someone who had sat with worse things than this for a very long time. She came with a younger colleague who took notes and said almost nothing. She shook Victoria's hand, declined coffee, and sat down in Emily's conference room with the straightforward economy of someone who didn't have time for atmospheric setup. Let me tell you what we know, she said, and then I need you to tell me everything. What Sandra Reyes knew was this. The man presenting himself as Damien Cross had operated under at least 4 different names over the past 9 years. The pattern was consistent. He identified wealthy women in transition, usually post-divorce, gained access through legitimate referral networks, built trust over a period of 4 to 8 weeks, and executed a single large transfer before dissolving the holding entity. 7 confirmed victims across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Total confirmed losses in excess of $11 million. Multiple cases where victims hadn't reported because they were embarrassed, or because they'd been convinced the failure was a market issue, or because coming forward meant admitting publicly that they'd been deceived. Victoria sat with all of this. Preston Hale, she said. My referral. Mr. Hale is not a suspect, Reyes said. He was used as a conduit. We believe his participation in what he thought was a legitimate syndicate was genuine. He was also being defrauded. His position never existed as anything more than a mechanism to give Cross access to his referral network. Reyes looked at her steadily. He will need to be informed at some point. That will be a difficult conversation. Victoria thought about Preston. Good, careful, well-meaning Preston who had called her with genuine enthusiasm. I'll handle that conversation, she said. Reyes nodded. They went through everything, every meeting, every document, every phone call. Victoria described the pattern Landon had identified, the way each conversation moved her incrementally further toward comfort, and Reyes wrote something down and said, without looking up, that's the most consistent single behavior across all the cases. The incremental shift. Nobody reports feeling pushed. Everyone reports feeling like they came to the decision themselves. Because you do, Victoria said. That's the sophistication of it. Yes, Reyes said. Exactly. They talked for 2.5 hours. At the end of it, Reyes closed her folder and looked at Victoria with the direct assessment she'd had from the beginning. What I'm going to ask you to do is not comfortable, she said. I'm going to ask you to keep the meeting you've already implied is happening at end of week. I'm going to ask you to tell him you're ready to move forward. Victoria held that. You want him to believe the transfer is going to happen, she said. We need him physically present and executing the transaction before we can move. If he runs, Reyes paused. He's done it before. One previous case where the target stalled too long. He was gone inside 48 hours and resurfaced 14 months later in another state under a different name. So you need him to believe he has me? Yes. The room was quiet for a moment. What does that look like practically? Victoria said. A meeting. Likely at your home. He's been moving toward home settings in later stages. It creates intimacy, lowers defenses. You tell him you've decided to commit. You present as if you're prepared to execute the wire transfer. We'll have a team positioned. The moment he initiates any documentation toward the transfer, we move. Victoria sat with this. My home, she said. We understand if that's not comfortable, Reyes said. We can find alternatives. But based on the pattern, no, Victoria said. My home is fine. She looked at Reyes. I want him out of this. Completely. That's the goal, Reyes said. Then let's do it. She called Landon that evening. She was still at Emily's office. It was past 6, the building was mostly empty, and she sat in the conference room with the city lights coming on outside and her notes spread across the table, and she called him because calling him had become the thing she did when something happened. "They want to set him up at the house," she said. "Final meeting. I tell him I'm in. He comes to collect. The agents are there." A silence. "At Maplewood Lane," he said. "Yes." Another silence. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like it's the fastest way to end it," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked out the window at the city. "I feel like he's already been in enough of my life," she said. "I'd like him to be the last thing that happens there and then for it to be done." "When?" "Friday. End of week. Reyes wants to move before he has reason to run." "Okay." Landon was quiet. She could hear him thinking. "I'll be there." "Landon." "Not inside. You don't need me inside." His voice was even. "But I'll be there." She started to argue and stopped. She thought about arguing. She decided against it. Some offers you take. "Okay," she said. "Okay." A pause. "Try to eat dinner." "You sound like Dara." "Dara sounds smart." She almost laughed. She did, a little. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Victoria." She sat in the conference room for a while after, looking at the city. The days between Monday and Friday had a specific quality. The quality of time that is already decided but hasn't happened yet. Victoria went to work. She answered emails. She had meetings. She called Damian Cross on Wednesday afternoon and told him she was ready to finalize. And she listened to the warmth in his voice ratchet up a precise increment, and she kept her own voice level and easy and said she'd see him Friday at 7 at her home address, which she texted him afterward. She gave Reyes the address. Reyes came by Thursday afternoon with her colleague to walk the house. Quiet, professional, noting entry points and sight lines with the methodical attention of people who did this regularly. They would be positioned outside before 6. They would have audio. Victoria would wear nothing that could be construed as recording equipment by a cautious target. The house itself was covered. "If he brings anyone," Reyes said. "He won't," Victoria said. "It's always just him. That's part of it." Reyes nodded. Thursday night, Landon came by. Not planned. He called at 8 and said he was in the neighborhood, which was not entirely true since the neighborhood was 20 minutes from his house. And she said, "Come in." He brought coffee from the place on Lexington, and they sat in the living room and didn't talk about Friday directly for most of an hour. He told her about a job he'd started in the River Arts District, a commercial building from the 40s that the new owners wanted to restore rather than gut. She told him about a call she'd had with Richard Hendricks, who had been, given the circumstances, remarkably decent about the whole thing, more interested in the fraud angle than the gossip blog angle, which was what she'd expected from him if she was honest. "Preston," she said at some point, "I need to tell him." "What are you going to say?" "That he was used, that it wasn't his fault, that the referral was the mechanism and he couldn't have known." She looked at the fireplace. "He's going to feel terrible." "Yeah," Landon said, "he will." "There's not really a way around that." "No," he said, "there isn't." He looked at her. "You're going to be good at that conversation." "Why?" "Because you won't let him off the hook by pretending it's nothing. You'll tell him the truth, and you'll mean it when you say it wasn't his fault." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I've watched you do hard things," he said simply. "You don't soften them into something smaller. You just do them straight." She held that. "That's one of the better things anyone has said to me in a while," she said. "It's just what I see," he said. Not performed, not pointed, just true. They sat with that for a moment, the fire doing its quiet work. "Are you scared?" he said. She thought about honest. "Yes," she said. "Not of him specifically, of standing in my own house and being the person who almost fell for it, having that be true, even for a second, even just in the room." He was quiet. "You didn't fall for it," he said. "I came close." "Everyone comes close to things," he said. "That's not the same as falling." He looked at her steadily. "You found it. You stopped it. That's the story." She was quiet. "I need it to be the story," she said. "It is," he said. She believed him, not because he said it, because he meant it, and she'd learned over the past weeks that Landon Pierce did not say things he didn't mean. He left at 10. She walked him to the door and he stood on the porch for a moment in the November cold. "I'll be in my truck," he said. "Down the block. You won't see me. You don't have to." "I know." He looked at her. "I'll be there anyway." She looked at him in the porch light, and she thought about a lot of things, and she said none of them. "Thank you," she said. He went down the steps. Friday arrived. She spent the day at the office in the particular focused calm of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting to execute it. Dara knew Victoria had told her the outline, not every detail. And Dara brought her lunch without being asked and didn't say anything unnecessary, which was exactly right. At 5:30, Victoria drove home. At 5:55, she saw Reyes's car and one other unmarked vehicle positioned on the block, which she recognized only because she knew what to look for. At 6:15, she changed out of her work clothes into something that said home, without saying, "I'm trying to appear comfortable," which was a distinction she'd thought about more than she expected to. At 6:45, she made tea she didn't drink and sat in the living room and looked at the mantelpiece. At 6:58, Damien Cross rang the doorbell. She answered it. He was exactly as he always was. She would think about that later, how completely consistent he was, how nothing in his manner gave way even now. He smiled. He said it was a beautiful home. He stepped inside and looked around with the appreciative attention he always gave to environments, which she now understood was professional observation disguised as social grace. "Thank you for having me here," he said. "Of course," she said. "Come in." They sat in the living room. He had a slim portfolio with him. She had a pad of paper and a pen she set on the coffee table. He talked. She listened. He outlined the final steps, the documentation she'd need to review, the wire transfer process, the timeline once her commitment was confirmed. His voice was warm. His eyes were easy. He was, she thought, sitting across from him, genuinely talented at this. The waste of that was its own particular kind of awful. "I think we're ready," she said when he paused. He smiled. "I'm glad to hear that." He opened his portfolio and removed a document, the commitment letter, the wire instructions, 2 pages she'd need to sign. "If you want a review." "I've reviewed it," she said. She picked up the pen. She held it for a moment. She looked at Damien Cross across her coffee table, in her living room, in her house that smelled like old wood and was warm and was hers, and she set the pen down. "Actually," she said, "I have one more question." He waited. Patient. Easy. "I want to ask you about Carolyn Marsh," she said. Something happened in his face, small, controlled. But there. Carolyn Marsh was the name Agent Reyes had given her, one of the confirmed victims, the case with the most complete documentation, a woman in Charlotte who had lost $400,000 2 years ago and whose case had been the anchor of the federal investigation. Damien Cross looked at her. "I don't know that name," he said. "No?" Victoria said. "That's interesting, because she knows yours." The room changed. It was subtle. Nothing dramatic, no sudden movement, just a shift in the quality of the air, the way a room changes when everyone in it finally understands what kind of room it is. He started to stand. The front door opened. Agent Reyes came in with 2 other agents, moving quickly and calmly, the way people move when they've done something many times and don't need theater to do it. "Mr. Cross," Reyes said, "I'm going to need you to keep your hands where we can see them." He stood very still. Victoria stood. She stepped back from the coffee table and she watched Agent Reyes cross her living room toward the man who had spent 7 weeks building a meticulous construction of trust with the intention of dismantling her financial security and leaving nothing behind. She was very calm. She had expected to feel more, some kind of crescendo. What she felt was simpler than that. A door closing, a thing ending, the specific satisfaction of a weight that had been held for weeks finally being set down. Damien Cross was handcuffed in her living room. He looked at her once before they moved him toward the door. Just once. She held his gaze. She did not look away. They moved him out. Reyes paused at the door and looked at Victoria. "You did well," she said, which was plain-spoken and therefore the right thing. "Is it enough?" Victoria said. "For the other cases." "It's a significant step," Reyes said. Yes. They went out. The house was quiet. Victoria stood in her living room for a moment. She looked at the mantelpiece. She looked at the antique light coming in from the dining room. She looked at the pad of paper and the pen on the coffee table, and she picked up the pen and put the cap back on it and set it on the side table. Then she went to the front door and opened it. Landon's truck was at the curb. She could see him through the windshield. He'd gotten out at some point, was standing beside the truck with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the agent's vehicles further down the block. He turned when she appeared in the doorway. She stood on the porch. He looked at her. She nodded. He walked up the front path toward her, and she watched him come, and the porch light was on, and the night was cold, and the maple in the yard had lost most of its leaves, and he came up the steps and stopped in front of her. "It's done?" he said. "It's done," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something simple. He put his arms around her, the way you hold someone when the holding is the only right thing, not romantic, not calculated, just solid and real and present. And she put her head against his shoulder, and she let herself be held. She was shaking slightly. She hadn't known that until it stopped. They stood on the porch for a minute, maybe more. When she stepped back, she didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her. And the thing that had been building between them for 2 months was right there in the space between their faces, unhidden and impossible to misread, and neither of them said anything about it. Not yet. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He followed her in. She closed the door behind them. The night after Damien Cross was walked out of her living room in handcuffs, Victoria slept for 9 hours without waking. She hadn't done that in years. Not since before the marriage started going sideways. Maybe not since before that. She was someone who slept in pieces. 4 hours, then an hour of lying awake cataloging tomorrow, then another 3 if she was lucky. She had accepted this about herself the way you accept things that have been true long enough to feel permanent. She woke up at 7:15 on Saturday morning to gray November light coming through the bedroom curtains and the particular stillness of a house that had been through something and was resting. She lay there for a while and looked at the ceiling and took stock of herself the way you do after something ends, checking, quietly, what was still there. She was tired. She was relieved. She was angry in a way that had cooled overnight into something more like resolve. She was something else, too, something she didn't have a clean name for yet. A kind of openness, maybe, like a window left ajar after a long time of being sealed. She thought about Landon. After the agents had left Friday night, they'd sat in the kitchen for 2 hours, not talking about Damien Cross. That was done, closed, a door she had no interest in reopening that evening. They talked about other things. He told her about a house he'd worked on in his first year on his own, a bungalow in West Asheville where the owner had insisted on being present for every single step of the renovation and had asked questions Landon hadn't always known the answers to, which had sent him home each night to read until he did. She told him about her first board meeting after taking over Langley Ventures, when she'd been 31, and 2 of the existing board members had spent the first 40 minutes addressing her comments to the man sitting next to her before she'd stopped the meeting and addressed it directly. "What did you say?" he'd asked. "I said, gentlemen, I notice you keep turning to look at Raymond when I speak. Raymond is excellent, but he's the CFO. I'm the CEO. You're welcome to keep looking at him, but I'm the one who will be deciding whether you remain on this board, so it might be worth redirecting your attention." Landon had looked at her. How old was Raymond? 62. He nearly died of embarrassment on my behalf. He told me afterward that was the most uncomfortable moment of his professional life. She'd paused. He's been my loudest advocate on the board ever since. "Because you didn't soften it," Landon said. "Because I was right, and I knew I was right, and there was nothing to soften." He'd smiled at that, not the slight, restrained version she'd seen in the early weeks, but fully, like he'd stopped managing it. It had done something to her equilibrium that she'd addressed by refilling her tea. He'd left at 11. At the door, he'd looked at her for a moment the way he sometimes did, steady and direct, and with that thing behind it she couldn't keep pretending she didn't recognize. And he'd said, "Get some sleep." And she'd said she would, and she had. And now it was Saturday morning, and she was lying in bed in her house that smelled like old wood and felt like hers, and she was thinking about him. She allowed herself to think about him for a while, not managing it, just letting it be what it was. It was considerable. She got up, made coffee, and called Preston Hale at 9 a.m. It was a hard conversation, which she'd known it would be. Preston went quiet when she laid out what they'd found: the fabricated references, the false investor identities, his own position that had never existed as anything more than a social credential being used without his knowledge. She could hear him processing it in real time, the silence going through several different qualities before he spoke. "I brought him to you," he said. "You were used," she said. "That's different." "Victoria, Preston, he spent months building a relationship with you specifically because of who you know and how much people trust your word. Your integrity was the tool. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's a failure of his decency." She paused. "He's in federal custody. He won't do this to anyone else." A long silence. "Are you all right?" Preston said. "I didn't lose anything," she said. "I came close, but no. Because you're careful. Because something felt wrong, and I listened to it," she said. Another silence. When Preston spoke again, his voice was rougher than she'd heard it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that doesn't—" "It does," she said. "It does help." She meant it. "I'll be in touch after the new year. I want to have lunch." She hung up and sat with the aftermath of that for a while. The specific weight of a hard conversation done the right way, which is its own kind of exhaustion. Then she pulled up her email and found 14 messages she hadn't dealt with since Thursday, and she worked through them methodically, and by noon she felt something close to ordinary. Dara called at 12:30. "I'm not working," Victoria said by way of greeting. "I know. I'm calling as a person, not as your assistant." "Go ahead." "Are you okay?" "Yes," Victoria said, genuinely. "Because you've said that before when you were not genuinely okay." "I know. This time I mean it." She looked out the kitchen window at the yard where the bare maple was doing something architectural against the gray sky. "I slept 9 hours." A pause. "Oh," Dara said, and her voice did something that was almost emotional. "Good. That's really good, Victoria. Don't make it weird." "I'm not. I'm just... good." "Okay. That's all I needed to know." After Dara hung up, Victoria stood at the window for a while. The yard looked different without leaves, more structural, all line and branch, the essential shape of things visible now that the covering was gone. She'd been looking at this yard since October. She thought she might like it better this way, actually, all that honest architecture. She was thinking about the yard, which is why she almost missed it. There was a box on the kitchen table. Not a new box. She'd been living around it for 2 weeks without addressing it, a medium-sized cardboard box that the movers had brought from her storage unit when she'd finally cleared out the last of the things she hadn't unpacked after the divorce. She'd put it in the kitchen, meaning to go through it, and had not gone through it. She went through it now. Most of it was what she'd expected. Things from the apartment before the marriage. Small objects that had lived in drawers and not been important enough to deal with, and not unimportant enough to throw away. A travel mug she'd liked. A set of bookmarks. An old date book from the year she'd launched the company, which she flipped through for a moment with the strange tenderness you feel toward your younger self's handwriting. At the bottom of the box was a smaller box. A shoebox, sealed with tape that had dried to the point of barely holding. Her mother's handwriting on the side. Carol. Hendersonville things. Keep. Carol was her grandmother. Victoria sat down at the kitchen table. The Hendersonville house. The one from Summers, the one built in the 20s, the one with the old glass in the windows and the creak of the floors. Her grandmother had died when Victoria was 24, and the house had been sold, and that had been its own kind of grief. The particular grief of a place that held a version of you that doesn't exist anywhere else. She opened the shoebox. Inside, photographs mostly. Old ones, black and white. Some color photos from the 70s that had the washed-out quality of that era. A few letters rubber-banded together. A small journal with a cracked spine. The kind of accumulation that happens at the bottom of closets and in the back of drawers when someone has lived in one place for a very long time. She went through the photographs slowly. Her grandmother as a young woman, genuinely young, 20s maybe, in a summer dress in front of the Hendersonville house, squinting slightly in the sun. Victoria had always known she looked like her grandmother. Looking at the photograph now, the resemblance was striking enough to be almost uncomfortable. More photographs. Family ones she recognized: her mother as a child, her grandfather, a succession of Christmases and summers, and the ordinary archive of a life. She set each one aside carefully. And then, near the bottom, a photograph she didn't recognize. Two women standing in front of what appeared to be a building under construction, framework visible, no walls yet, just skeleton. Both were young, late 20s maybe, and they were laughing at something that had happened just before or after the shutter clicked, the kind of laughter that's between people who know each other very well. Her grandmother was on the left. The woman on the right she had never seen before. Dark hair, something familiar in the set of her jaw that Victoria couldn't place. On the back of the photograph, her grandmother's handwriting. Ruth and me, October 1974. The site. Our dream before it had walls. Victoria looked at the photograph for a long time. Ruth. The site. Our dream. She went through the letters. They were between her grandmother and this woman, Ruth. The rubber band disintegrated when she removed it, dry and brittle. The earliest letter was from 1971, the latest from 1979. She read them in order, which took a long time because they were handwritten and because she found herself reading slowly, not wanting to go faster than the letters themselves intended. What emerged gradually over 8 years of correspondence was this. Her grandmother and a woman named Ruth had met in 1969 at a hospitality industry conference in Charlotte. They had become close quickly. The letters had the shorthand of deep friendship, full of references she couldn't always decode, and a shared vocabulary that had clearly developed over time. They had, by 1972, been making concrete plans to open a small inn together somewhere in the western Carolina mountains. An inn that was not a corporate thing, but something personal, something built around the idea that a place could feel like home to people who needed one. The photograph was from the site they'd chosen. In 1978, the letters changed in tone. Ruth had a husband, a young son. Her husband had been offered a position in another city, or perhaps it had been another set of circumstances. The letters were not entirely specific, but something had pulled Ruth away. The 1979 letter was the last one, and it was short and careful and sad in the way that endings are when no one is at fault. I still think it would have been something, her grandmother had written, in what appeared to be a draft tucked into the last envelope, perhaps never sent. I hope you're happy where you are. I hope the boy is well. I will always think the Mountain Inn was one of the best ideas we ever had, and I will always wish we'd had the chance to find out. Victoria sat at her kitchen table with the letters spread around her and the photograph in her hand, and she felt the loss of something she'd never known was there. A version of her grandmother she hadn't been given access to, a dream that had dissolved before Victoria had existed to know about it. She looked at the woman in the photograph. Ruth. Dark hair. Something in the jaw. The familiarity of it tugged at her again. She didn't place it yet. She set the photograph down carefully among the other things, and she sat in her kitchen in the November light, and she felt something she couldn't fully articulate, a connection to something older than herself, older than the house, a sense of threads she couldn't quite trace. She called her mother that afternoon. Her mother, Catherine, lived in Raleigh and was the kind of woman who had strong opinions about everything and expressed them with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had been right enough times to have stopped second-guessing herself. She and Victoria had always had the relationship of two people who were very similar in ways that made them occasionally difficult for each other, and very different in ways that made them occasionally essential. I found some of Grandma Carol's things, Victoria said. Letters, and a photograph with a woman named Ruth. A pause. Ruth Pierce, her mother said without hesitation. Victoria went very still. You know her? I knew of her. Mama talked about her sometimes. Ruth Pierce, she married a man named James Pierce. They moved to somewhere in North Carolina, I think. I never met her. A pause. Why are you asking? Victoria looked at the photograph. Dark hair, the set of the jaw. Pierce, she said. Yes. Why? She didn't answer immediately. She was doing the specific math that you do when something you thought was coincidence begins to look like it might be something else. Not impossible, not miraculous, just the kind of thing that happens when two families live in the same part of the world for long enough. Landon Pierce, she said, the contractor who did the renovation. A very long pause. You think he's Ruth's son? Her mother said. He's from Asheville. He mentioned his mother once, just that she died some years ago. He's 32. She did the math again. If Ruth moved here in the late 70s, early 80s, Victoria. Her mother's voice had an odd quality she couldn't name. That would be something. I don't know anything yet, Victoria said. It's a photograph and a name and a geographical coincidence. You sound like you're trying not to get ahead of yourself. I am trying not to get ahead of myself. Because you've met this man and it matters to you, her mother said, with the particular accuracy that mothers sometimes deploy when they've been waiting for an opening. Victoria looked at the photograph on the table. I'm going to find out if it's true first, she said. She did. She spent the rest of Saturday afternoon doing what she knew how to do. Research, careful and methodical. Property records, obituaries, public records. Ruth Pierce, née Callahan, had married James Pierce in 1973 in Buncombe County. James Pierce had died in 2009. Ruth Pierce had died in 2016. They had one son. Landon James Pierce, born 1993, Asheville, North Carolina. Victoria sat with that for a long time. Their mothers had been close. Their mothers had shared a dream, a specific, concrete, passionate dream about building something together in these mountains. That dream had been separated by geography and circumstance before it ever had walls, and their children had ended up through a house listing sent almost apologetically by a realtor, through a referral from 4 different clients, through an accumulation of ordinary decisions, living in the same city, working together, standing on the same porch in October looking at the same yard. She was not a mystical person. She did not reach for meaning in coincidence. She understood that the world was large and mostly random, and that people who looked for hidden patterns often found ones that weren't there. But this wasn't a pattern she'd looked for. This was a photograph at the bottom of a shoebox. She called Landon on Sunday morning. Can you come by? She said. A pause. Everything okay? Yes. I found something I want to show you. It's not bad. It's just something I think you should see. He came over at 10 with Sophie because it was Sunday, and Sophie was with him, and Victoria had said that was fine, which it was. Sophie arrived in a coat and boots and the focused energy of a child who had been told they were going somewhere without being told exactly why, and she immediately went to the living room to look at the mantelpiece again, which she appeared to have decided was her particular point of interest in the house. Victoria put coffee on and brought Landon to the kitchen table where the letters and photographs were spread out. She'd organized them overnight, put them in chronological order, labeled what she knew, made it as clear as possible. She watched his face as he looked at them. She explained first what the box was, where she'd found it, who her grandmother was. Then she showed him the photograph. He picked it up. He looked at it for a while without saying anything. She watched his face do something complicated and private. The woman on the right, he said. His voice was careful. Flat in the way that means the opposite of flat. Her name was Ruth, Victoria said. Ruth Callahan, later Ruth Pierce. He looked up from the photograph. She held his gaze. I checked the public records, she said. Your parents were James and Ruth Pierce. Your mother was born Ruth Callahan. The kitchen was quiet. She never talked about her, he said. I mean, she mentioned a friend once, from before she married my dad. She said she'd lost touch with someone who'd been important to her. He looked back at the photograph. She didn't give me a name. My grandmother mentioned her in letters over 8 years. They were going to open an inn together, here, in the mountains. He set the photograph down on the table. He looked at it from a distance, like he needed a little space from it. An inn. That was the plan. It fell apart when your mother moved. I don't know exactly why. The letters don't say precisely. He was quiet. Landon. She sat down across from him. I want to be careful about this. I don't want to make it into something it isn't. But, he said, but your mother and my grandmother knew each other. They were close. They had plans together that didn't happen. She looked at him steadily. And you ended up fixing my house. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. He said it slowly, like he was deciding how much to let it mean. I'm not saying it's more than it is, she said. What do you think it is? She thought about honest. I think it explains something, she said. I think maybe the reason this, she gestured imprecisely at the space between them, which they still hadn't named, but which was clearly present to both of them, felt easy from the beginning, felt like something that made sense. Maybe that's why. He looked at the photograph again. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the two of them at the table, looked at the spread of photographs and letters, and with the radar of children who know when a room has a particular weight to it, she came in quietly and stood beside her father and looked at the photograph he was looking at. "Who's that?" she said. Landon picked the photograph up and showed her. "That might be your Grandma Ruth," he said. "When she was young." Sophie looked at it. "She's laughing." "Yeah." "Who's the other lady?" Victoria answered. "My grandmother," she said. "When she was young, too." Sophie looked at the photograph and then at Victoria, and then at the photograph again with the focused processing of someone making connections. "They were friends?" "Yes," Victoria said. Sophie set the photograph back on the table carefully. She looked at Victoria with the gray eyes that went straight through things. "So you and Dad were kind of supposed to meet," she said. Landon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's one way to think about it," Victoria said. "It's a good way," Sophie said, with the conviction of a child who had decided, and went back to the living room. They sat with that for a moment, the kid logic of it, which was also not entirely wrong. "She's not subtle," Landon said. "No," Victoria said. "She isn't." She looked at him. "Do you want to take the photograph? Or copies of the letters?" "I'd like to read them," he said, "if that's okay." "Of course." He reached across the table and picked up the photograph again, more slowly this time, and she watched him look at his mother's young face, the woman his mother had been before he existed, before any of the life he'd known had happened. And she saw the specific way it landed in him, the way things land when they're about someone you've lost and can't ask. She knew that feeling. Not from her grandmother. She'd been young enough when Carol died that the grief had been real but simpler. From the divorce, maybe, in its way, the loss of the person you thought you were going to be. "She looked happy," she said. Quiet. "Yeah," he said. "She did." He set the photograph down. He picked up the top letter, the one from 1971, and he read it slowly, and she got up and refilled his coffee and her own, and looked out the kitchen window at the yard and gave him the space to do it. She could hear Sophie in the living room, singing something under her breath, some half-remembered melody. He read for a long time. She sat across from him and read a novel she'd been neglecting, and they were in the same room without talking, which was one of those things that's simple and also not simple at all. At some point, Sophie came in and asked if there was anything to eat, and Victoria found some crackers and cheese in the refrigerator, and Sophie sat at the corner of the table with her snack and looked at the photographs one by one while Landon kept reading, and it was domestic and ordinary and quietly extraordinary in a way that none of them remarked on. When he finished the last letter, Landon set it down and looked at the table for a moment. "They really meant to do it," he said. "Yes," Victoria said. "They really did." "An inn." He shook his head slowly. "My mother would have been good at that. She made everywhere feel like somewhere you wanted to stay." Victoria thought about her grandmother, the Hendersonville house, the way it had felt, the way Carol had been in it. "You learn to read a house." "My grandmother too," she said, "in different ways." He looked at her. "It's strange," he said. "Not bad strange, just strange," she agreed. He almost smiled. "Yeah." Sophie, who had been eating her crackers and listening with the apparent detachment of a child focused on a snack, said without looking up, "You should try to do the inn." They both looked at her. "The one they were going to do," she said. "You could do it now." "Sophie," Landon started. "I'm just saying," she said. "They didn't get to. You could." She finished her crackers and carried her plate to the sink and rinsed it with the unsentimental practicality of a child who had said what she meant and didn't need to defend it. And then she went back to the living room. Landon looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Landon. Neither of them said anything about the inn, which did not mean neither of them was thinking about it. The afternoon got long in the way of November Sundays. They ended up in the living room eventually, all three of them, Sophie on the floor with a book. She'd gotten to Chapter 9 of Charlotte's Web, which Landon reported as a significant development. and Landon on the other end of the couch from Victoria, and the fire doing its work. It was the most uncomplicated Victoria had felt in months, possibly longer. She knew what it meant. She wasn't hiding from it anymore, just being careful with it, the way you're careful with something you don't want to break before it's had a chance to become what it's trying to become. They'd both been through things that had made them cautious. Landon had lost his wife. She had survived a marriage that had slowly, quietly taught her that intimacy without being truly known was its own kind of isolation. Neither of them had gotten here easily. Neither of them was going to throw themselves at something just because it felt good. But it felt good. She sat on her couch in her restored house with the antique light coming through the doorway and a child reading on the floor and a man she'd known for 2 months who felt somehow like someone she'd been heading toward for longer than that, and she let herself be in it without managing it. That was new. That was something. The week after that Sunday was different in a way she could feel but not entirely articulate. The Damien Cross news broke publicly on Tuesday. A press release from the federal prosecutor's office. Brief, factual, naming no victims. The financial fraud that had operated across 3 states. The arrest? The ongoing investigation. Victoria's name was not in it. Emily had made sure of that, but the story circulated in local business news and she fielded several calls from people who had clearly done enough math to understand she might have been involved, and she handled each call with the same economy. The matter was with federal authorities. She had no comment. She was grateful for their concern. David Chen called from the board. "I'm assuming," he said, "that the Damien Cross situation is connected to the investment you mentioned in passing 2 months ago." "Tangentially," she said. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Victoria." He paused. "I've been on a lot of boards. I've watched a lot of people handle a lot of things. What you did here, identifying a problem, managing it, closing it without a public incident, and without company exposure, that's not a small thing." She held the phone. "Thank you, David," she said. The Asheville Buzz retraction came out on Thursday. It was not gracious, which she hadn't expected. It was brief and technical. A statement that the photos published in a previous article had been presented without appropriate context, and that the publication regretted any implication about the professional conduct of the subject. Victoria's PR director sent her a screenshot with the message, "Such as it is." Victoria wrote back, "Good enough." What mattered was that it was there, that the record, imperfect as it was, had been corrected. She told Landon about it on the phone Thursday evening. "Retraction's up," she said. "I saw," he said. "I follow Asheville Buzz, apparently. I need to rethink my media consumption." "It's not gracious." "Was it going to be?" "No," she admitted, "but it's there. That's all it needed to be." A pause. "How's the board situation?" "Better than it was. David Chen was decent about it." She leaned against the kitchen counter. Hendricks Group called off the additional scrutiny. Apparently federal fraud arrest narratives are more sympathetic than gossip blog narratives. "Funny how that works." "Yes." She paused. "Landon, I want to talk to you about the photograph." "Okay." "Not on the phone," she said. "Can we—" "I want to show you something else I found. Another letter from the last year of their correspondence. I think it has more in it than I gave it credit for the first time I read it." "When?" "This weekend?" "Saturday, if Sophie's schedule works." "Sophie is always available for visits to the house on Maplewood Lane," he said. "I've been informed of this several times." "Then Saturday," Victoria said. "Come early. I'll make breakfast." A pause. "You cook?" he said. "I'm capable of making breakfast, Landon. I'm a grown adult." "That's not a yes." "It's close enough to a yes." "Come at 9. He was laughing when she hung up. She stood in the kitchen, and she was smiling, which she noticed, and she didn't do anything to stop it. She pulled the last letter out again, the one she'd almost set aside, the draft that her grandmother had maybe never sent. She read it again slowly. "I still think it would have been something. I hope you're happy where you are. I hope the boy is well." The boy, Ruth's son, who was now the man who had fixed her porch and found her mantelpiece and told her to trust the thing that was bothering her and showed up at the curb on a Friday night in November because he said he'd be there, and so he was. "I hope the boy is well." She set the letter down. He was, she thought. He really was. She thought about a mountain inn that had never had walls. She thought about two women in a photograph laughing at something a camera had caught the edge of. She thought about a dream that had been separated and scattered and that had arrived in pieces in the hands of people who had no idea they were carrying it. She was a careful person. She did not reach for meanings that weren't there. But she sat in her kitchen in the dark on a Thursday night in November, and she thought that sometimes things didn't need to be miraculous to be significant. Sometimes they just needed to be true. And this was true. Their mothers had loved each other. Their mothers had wanted to build something together in these mountains, and here they were. Their children, in the same mountains, rebuilding something else. That was enough. That was actually quite a lot. He arrived at 9 on Saturday with Sophie and a bag from the bakery on Lexington because he had decided that if Victoria was going to attempt breakfast, he was going to provide backup without making it a thing, which he managed by simply setting the bag on the counter and saying Sophie wanted pastries, and letting Sophie, who had not specifically requested pastries, take the credit without contradiction. Sophie accepted this arrangement without comment, which meant she understood it. Victoria looked at the bag, and then at Landon, and then at Sophie. "Did you want pastries?" she said. Sophie considered. "I do now," she said, and sat at the kitchen table. Victoria had made eggs. They were slightly overdone on the edges in the way of someone who had been doing something else while cooking them. She'd been rereading the last of her grandmother's letters, and had come back to the stove a minute past the right moment. She put them on the table without apology, and Landon ate them without comment, and Sophie ate hers with the pastry simultaneously, which was not technically breakfast etiquette, but which Landon apparently decided was not the battle of the morning. It was the kind of breakfast that's about the sitting together more than the food. Victoria thought that while she was eating it, and then thought it was the kind of thing she would not have thought a year ago, would not have seen the value in, would have categorized as inefficient. An hour on a Saturday morning with eggs that were slightly overdone, and pastries she hadn't planned for, and a child talking about something that had happened at school on Friday, involving a misplaced library book and a substitute teacher named Mr. Fenwick, who had the voice of someone much taller than he was. She had eaten a lot of efficient breakfasts alone in her apartment downtown. This was better. After breakfast, when Sophie had gone to do her particular inventory of the living room, which had become a ritual apparently, a checking of the familiar things, Victoria spread the letters on the table again and showed Landon the one she'd wanted him to see. The draft. Her grandmother's handwriting, slightly different from the sent letters, more compressed, like she'd been writing quickly or carefully, or both. He read it quietly. She watched him read it. She had learned over the weeks how Landon looked when he was going through something. He got very still, and he looked like he was listening rather than reading, like the words were being said to him rather than processed by his eyes. When he finished, he sat with it for a moment. "I hope the boy is well." She knew she was writing to someone who wouldn't be able to write back, he said. That's what a draft is. She was saying something she needed to say to someone who couldn't hear it anymore. Victoria hadn't thought of it that way exactly. She sat with it. "Yes," she said. "I think so." "My mother was like that," he said. She had people she talked to in her head for years after they were gone. She'd be cooking or driving, and she'd say something under her breath that wasn't for the room. He paused. "I used to think she was talking to my dad after he died, but maybe it wasn't always him." Victoria looked at the letter. Maybe she was answering this. He looked at her. "Maybe she was having that conversation somewhere," Victoria said, "the one they didn't get to finish." He didn't say anything. He looked at the letter for another moment, and then he picked it up carefully, like she'd watched him pick up old wood, with the awareness of something that had lasted and deserved to last longer, and he set it down. "I'd like a copy," he said, "if that's okay." "I was going to make copies of everything for you," she said. "The photograph, too." "Thank you." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the letters on the table and at the two adults, and she said, "Are you talking about the grandmas again?" "Yes," Landon said. "Good," she said, with the satisfaction of someone whose suggestion had been taken seriously, and she went back to the living room. They looked at each other. "She's going to be insufferable about this," Landon said. "She's earned it," Victoria said. He almost argued and then didn't because Victoria was right. What happened over the weeks that followed was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. Later, when Victoria tried to identify the moment things changed, she couldn't find one. There was no single conversation, no declared turning point, no moment when one of them said, "This is what this is," and the other said yes. It accumulated instead the way real things do, in small increments that each seemed ordinary on their own, and only showed themselves as significant when you stepped back far enough to see the shape of them. Landon came by on a Tuesday because the radiator in the guest room had started knocking differently, and she texted him about it and he fixed it, and they ate dinner from the Thai place on Haywood because neither of them had planned to eat together, but it was 6:30 and the food existed. He came by on a Saturday with Sophie because Sophie had a school project that involved interviewing someone about their job, and Victoria had, apparently, been nominated by Sophie without being asked, which Victoria only found out when Sophie arrived with a notebook and a list of questions written in careful cursive. "I'm your interview," Victoria said. "Dad's a contractor," Sophie said, settling into the chair across from Victoria with the notebook open. "I needed someone different." "What does different mean?" "Someone who does something I don't already know about." She clicked her pen. "First question, what do you do every day?" Victoria looked at Landon, who was leaning against the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had known about this and had chosen not to warn her, which she filed away for later. She answered Sophie's questions. All 11 of them, which covered what CEOs did, how much they got paid. Sophie asked this with the directness of someone who had not yet learned it was rude, and Victoria answered honestly, which made Sophie's eyes go briefly wide. Whether it was scary to be in charge, and the last question, which Sophie appeared to have written separately from the others in slightly different handwriting, whether Victoria liked living in the house by herself. A brief pause. "I like the house," Victoria said. "It took me a while to figure out why I bought it, but I think I do now." Sophie wrote something in the notebook. "Why did you buy it?" "Because I needed somewhere that felt like mine," Victoria said. "I'd been living in places that looked right, but didn't feel right. This one felt right even when it didn't look right yet." Sophie considered this. "Like how a thing can be good before it's fixed?" "Exactly like that." Sophie wrote that down too. Landon, in the doorway, was looking at the floor. She could see the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and she knew, from 2 months of watching him, that he was doing something with his face that he didn't want her to see. She looked back at Sophie's notebook. "Is that all your questions?" she said. "Yes," Sophie said. She closed the notebook with the brisk finality of an 8-year-old who has completed a task. "Thank you for the interview." "You're welcome." "You gave good answers." "I tried." Sophie slid off the chair and looked at her father. "Can I go look at the mantelpiece?" "You've looked at the mantelpiece 6 times, Landon said. 7 is different, Sophie said, and went. The kitchen was quiet. Landon looked up from the floor. He looked at Victoria across the kitchen table, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then Victoria said, because she had gotten tired of being careful with it, and because being careful with it had stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like avoidance. "I need to say something." He waited. "I'm not good at this," she said. "At whatever this is. I was in a marriage for 4 years where I thought I was doing everything right, and it still didn't hold, and I came out of it deciding that I was better at work than at people. I was probably right at the time." She looked at the table. "But I think I've been using it as an excuse for longer than it was true." Landon was quiet. "I keep doing the thing where I figure out what I feel and then spend 2 weeks deciding whether it's a good idea," she said. "And I'm tired of it. It's not actually careful. It's just slow. It's not protecting me from anything. It's just tiring," he said. "Yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put both his hands flat on the table, which was a thing he did when he was being deliberate. "You want me to say something," he said. "I want you to say what's true," she said. "That's all." He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. When he looked up, he had the expression he got when he was going to say something he'd thought about, not rehearsed, just considered. "When Claire died," he said, his wife, the name he rarely used, "I didn't think I'd build anything again. Not the work kind of building. I mean, the other kind. The putting yourself in a position to lose something again." He paused. "I've been doing that for 4 years. Keeping things in the right category. Sophie is in one category, work is in one category. And everything that might be the other thing gets managed before it becomes a problem. She watched him. You stopped being manageable about 6 weeks in, he said. I know, she said. It scared me, he said. It still does a little, but He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of talking easy. She could see him working at it, the way she'd watched him work at a difficult repair. Not quitting, just being patient with the resistance. I'm not interested in keeping you in a category, he said. That's what I know. Victoria sat with that. Okay, she said. Okay? That's enough for now, she said. That's actually exactly enough. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face relaxed. Not dramatically, just the specific easing of someone who had been holding something and has been told they can set it down. Sophie's going to be extremely annoying about being right, he said. Sophie is 8, and she figured this out before either of us, Victoria said. She's earned annoying. They were both smiling when Sophie came back from the living room, and she looked at them and made no comment but wrote something in her notebook, which she then closed. December arrived. With it came cold that had real weight to it. The Western Carolina mountain kind, the kind that came off the ridgeline and settled into the valleys and made the old houses creak in particular ways that Victoria now knew how to read. The maple in the yard was bare and structural against the gray sky, and she liked it this way, and had stopped being surprised by that. Damian Cross was formally indicted on 12 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of money laundering, and 3 counts of identity fraud in the second week of December. Agent Reyes called Victoria personally to let her know, which was not protocol, but which felt like something Reyes had decided to do anyway. The indictment named 8 victims by initial only across 3 states over 6 years. The confirmed losses were just over $13 million. Will it go to trial? Victoria asked. Almost certainly, Reyes said. His attorney is already talking, but the evidence is extensive. It will take time. I understand. You may be called to testify, Reyes said. At some point, I want to be honest about that. I know, Victoria said. I'll be there. She told Landon that evening on the phone. 12 counts, he said. 12. A pause. The women before you, he said. Yes. She'd been thinking about them. She didn't know their names, the indictment used initials, but she'd thought about them in the abstract, the human weight of what had been done to them, the specific violation of having your loss and your transition weaponized. I hope this helps them, she said. Whatever that looks like. It helps to see it named, Landon said. To have someone say this was real and this was wrong. Yes, she said, it does. Preston Hale sent her a bottle of wine and a note that said, I should have looked harder. I'm glad you did. She sent back a note that said, lunch in January, my treat. She meant it. The gossip blog, Asheville Buzz, lost 40% of its advertising revenue in December when 3 local businesses quietly pulled their ads following the retraction. Victoria's PR director reported this with professional neutrality. Victoria felt, if she was honest, a small and not entirely noble satisfaction about it that she allowed herself for exactly 1 minute and then moved on. The Hendricks Group renewed their commitment to the upcoming fund cycle in writing, which David Chen sent to her with a single-line message, told you. She wrote back, You did not specifically tell me this, David, but I appreciate the spirit of the statement. She was, she realized, enjoying herself. Not in the performative way, not the successful CEO enjoys her life version, but genuinely. In the specific way of someone who has stopped moving so fast that they can only feel the forward momentum and can now actually feel the ground beneath their feet. She had dinner with Landon on a Thursday, just the 2 of them, which was different from when Sophie was there. Not better, just different. The difference between 2 people in a room and 2 people seeing each other specifically. They went to a restaurant in the River Arts District that he'd mentioned once in passing and that she'd looked up afterward without telling him, which she admitted over the appetizers. You looked it up, he said. I was curious. When? She thought about it. Probably 6 weeks ago, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I drove past your house on a Tuesday, before the door thing. I didn't have a reason. I just drove past it. When? About 5 weeks ago. They ate in comfortable silence for a moment. We're bad at this, he said. We're getting better, she said. He raised his glass. To getting better, he said. She raised hers. To getting better. It wasn't elegant, it was true. Which was, she'd decided, the better of the two. Sophie turned 9 in January. She had a birthday party at Landon's house, 7 children from her class, a cake that Landon had clearly stressed about and that Sophie had declared acceptable, which was high praise. And Victoria came, which she'd been invited to 3 weeks in advance by Sophie, and a hand-delivered card that she later found out Sophie had made herself. Victoria had not been to a child's birthday party in years. She stood in Landon's kitchen, helping manage the plates and juice boxes and the specific organized chaos of 9-year-olds with sugar in them, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was not managing it. She was just in it. At one point, Landon passed behind her in the kitchen to get something from the refrigerator and said quietly, almost in her ear, "You doing okay?" And she said yes, and meant it without effort, and he moved on. And it was 12 seconds in a loud kitchen, and it was also something she held carefully. After the party, when the other kids had been collected by their parents and Sophie was in a condition of post-birthday depletion that she was refusing to acknowledge, Victoria helped clean up. Landon washed dishes and she dried, and Sophie sat at the kitchen table with a piece of leftover cake, eating it with the resigned slowness of someone who is tired but has decided that cake was the right thing to finish. "Good party," Victoria said. "It was okay," Sophie said. "It was excellent," Landon said. "You're never allowed to have 7 9-year-olds in this house again, but it was excellent." 8, Sophie said. "You're not helping." Sophie ate more cake. "Victoria," she said without looking up, "are you going to be here for Christmas?" Victoria paused mid-dry. Landon turned off the water. "Sophie," he said. "It's a question," Sophie said, still looking at her cake. Victoria looked at the dish towel in her hands. Then she looked at Landon, who was looking at Sophie with the expression of a man caught between parental correction and wanting to hear the answer. "I haven't made plans yet," Victoria said carefully. "You could come here," Sophie said. "We have extra chairs." "We have 2 extra chairs," Landon said. "We have exactly enough chairs." 2 is enough for Victoria," Sophie said, with flawless logic, and finished her cake. Landon turned back to the sink and turned the water back on, and Victoria caught the side of his face and saw what was on it, which was something she recognized because it was on her face too. The specific look of someone trying not to feel something as fully as they were feeling it. She folded the dish towel. "I'll think about it," she said to Sophie, who nodded as though this were entirely satisfactory, and slid off her chair and announced she was going to bed in the tone of someone who had decided this on their own and not been told to. She was asleep in 11 minutes. Victoria knew this because she and Landon sat in the kitchen afterward, and she asked, at some point, if Sophie was asleep. And he went to check and came back and said, "Out like a light, still in her party dress." Victoria looked at him. "You're going to leave her in the party dress?" "She's asleep." He sat down. "I'm not waking her up to change her clothes. She'll be annoyed and she won't sleep again for an hour." "Is that the calculus?" "That's the calculus." He folded his arms on the table. "Sorry about that. The Christmas thing. Don't apologize for it. She doesn't usually just..." "Landon." Victoria looked at him steadily. "I said don't apologize for it." He looked at her. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "Genuinely." He held that. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Christmas came. She came. It was not a large Christmas. Landon's sister Karen came with her husband and their 2 kids, who were 7 and 11 and who received Sophie's hospitality with the mixed results of cousins who loved each other and also argued about everything. Victoria arrived at noon with wine for Karen and her husband and a book for Sophie, a copy of A Wrinkle in Time that she'd thought about for 2 weeks, and that Sophie unwrapped with the specific focused attention of a child who reads the back before the front. "Have you read it?" Sophie said. "When I was about your age," Victoria said. "It's different every time." Sophie read the back, read the front, opened to the first page and read the first paragraph standing in the middle of the living room with the wrapping paper at her feet. "Sophie," Landon said. "I'm just checking," she said, and closed it reverently. Karen introduced herself to Victoria in the kitchen with the frank and warm assessment of someone who had been briefed by her brother in the limited way that Landon briefed people, which meant she knew the outline and had filled in the rest herself. She was several years older than Landon, with his same directness but more volume. and she had the ease of someone who had decided to like Victoria before she arrived and was simply confirming it. "He talks about you like you're a normal person," Karen said at one point, when they were in the kitchen and the men were in the other room and the kids were somewhere loud. "Is that good?" Victoria said. "It's very good," Karen said. "He used to talk about his jobs like they were jobs. Now he talks about his jobs like they're interesting." She paused. "He talked about your house like it was interesting for about 4 months." Victoria considered this. "He does good work." "He does." Karen looked at her. "He's happy. I'm not trying to make it weird. He's happy." I wanted to say it. Victoria looked at the kitchen doorway, through which she could hear Landon in the living room explaining something to Karen's husband with the particular patience he used for things he knew well. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." They ate dinner at 2 in the afternoon at Landon's table, all of them crowded in the way of too many people who don't quite fit but don't mind it, and the food was the kind of honest Christmas food that nobody photographs. A turkey that Landon had clearly fought with and mostly won, the side dishes that were clearly Karen's contribution and were better, bread that someone had bought from a bakery and presented as though they'd made it, which nobody interrogated. Victoria sat across from Sophie and next to Landon, and she ate the food and she talked and she laughed at things Karen said, and she felt, in the specific and unremarkable and entirely extraordinary way, that ordinary things are sometimes extraordinary, at home. Not at home the way the house on Maplewood Lane was home. That was hers, particular to her, the thing she'd needed to find. This was something else. The home that was other people, the one she hadn't known she was still missing. After dinner, when Karen and her family had gone, and Sophie had gone to bed with a wrinkle in time, she'd gotten 40 pages in over the course of the day in the way of a child who reads at every available surface. Victoria and Landon sat on the couch in the living room with the last of the wine and the quiet of a house after people have left it. "Good Christmas," he said. "Yes," she said. She was sitting close enough that their shoulders were touching, which had happened gradually and which neither of them had made a point of. She was very aware of it. "Karen likes you," he said. "Karen is easy to like back. She's a lot. I like a lot." She looked at the Christmas tree, a real one, slightly lopsided, decorated with the accumulated ornaments of years of different Christmases, some of them clearly Sophie's early craft projects. It was the least coordinated tree she'd ever sat next to, and she thought it was beautiful. "Landon." "Yeah, I want to tell you something." He turned his head to look at her. They were close enough that it didn't require much. "When I bought that house," she said, "I didn't know what I was looking for. I thought I was looking for space, a clean start, somewhere that was just mine, without any of the history of the last few years." She paused. "I wasn't looking for you. I wasn't looking for Sophie. I wasn't looking for any of this." He waited. "I'm glad I wasn't," she said. "Because if I'd been looking for it, I would have had a list of requirements and I would have managed it, and it would have been an acquisition instead of a—" She stopped. "I don't know what the word is." "Yeah, you do," he said. She looked at him. "A life," he said. "It would have been an acquisition instead of a life." She felt that land. "Yes," she said. "At." He reached over and took her hand, which he'd never done before, and it was simple and certain and not a question. And she held his hand and looked at the lopsided Christmas tree, and she felt the full weight of the year, all of it, the house and the fraud and the photograph and the letters and the breakfast with overdone eggs and Sophie's interview notebook and the porch in October and a joke in an antique store that had turned into something neither of them had expected and that had turned out to be exactly right. She had built things before. She knew how to build things. She knew the satisfaction of looking at something and knowing it was solid, knowing it would hold. This felt like that, she thought, but warmer. In February, she and Landon took a drive out to the Swannanoa Valley on a Saturday. Not for any particular reason. Sophie was at a friend's house, the day was clear, and Landon had mentioned once that there was a view from a ridge road out that way that was worth seeing in winter. The view was worth seeing. They stood at the pull-off and looked at the valley and the mountains and the gray winter sky and the particular beauty of a landscape that doesn't need to perform for you. "Sophie asked me last week," Landon said, looking at the view, "if you were going to live at our house someday." Victoria looked at the valley. "What did you say?" she said. I said that was a conversation for adults to have. What did she say to that? She said that seemed like a way of not answering. He paused. She's not wrong. Victoria stood with the cold air and the view and the man beside her who had fixed her house and found her mantelpiece and told her to trust the thing that was bothering her and stood at the curb on a Friday night in November because he said he'd be there. I'm not moving out of my house, she said. I know, he said. It's mine. I found it for a reason. I know, Victoria. But, she said, I'm very open to the idea of not always being alone in it. He turned to look at her. And I'm open, she said, to not being alone in other people's houses, too. More often. He looked at her for a moment. That's the least romantic way anyone has ever said that, he said. I told you I wasn't good at this. You're getting better. You said that. I did. He turned back to the view. His hand found hers the same way it had at Christmas. Simple, certain, not a question. I'm open to the same things, he said. They stood there for a while. The cold was real, and they were warm where they were standing together, and the mountains did not particularly care about either of them, which was one of the things she had always loved about mountains. Spring came in the way of Western Carolina springs, slow and then suddenly everywhere. The maple in the yard at Maplewood Lane began to bud, and Victoria noticed this on a morning in March, and stood in the kitchen looking at it with her coffee and felt the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of watching a thing come back. There was a morning in April when Sophie came over on a Saturday. This was routine now. Saturday mornings at the house, sometimes with Landon, sometimes Sophie was dropped off and Landon came later because he had a job to check on. And Sophie had something in her bag that she'd been carrying carefully and that she set on the kitchen table with the deliberateness of someone who has been planning this. 2 wooden birds, small, hand-carved, unpainted, one slightly larger than the other. The carving was careful and detailed. Not perfect, not the work of an adult, but with the patient attention of someone who had spent real time on it. Victoria looked at them. You made these, she said. Mr. Fenwick does woodworking club on Fridays, Sophie said. I've been going for 8 weeks. Sophie, Victoria picked one up gently. The wood was smooth where Sophie had sanded it, rough in a few places where she hadn't quite gotten it. It was real and imperfect, and someone had made it with their hands. These are beautiful. One's for you, Sophie said. One's for Dad. They go together. Victoria looked at the 2 birds on the kitchen table. Something happened in her chest that she didn't try to manage. How do you know they go together? She said. Sophie gave her a look that was so entirely Landon, patient, slightly amused, direct, that Victoria almost laughed. Because I made them that way, Sophie said. Landon arrived 40 minutes later, and Sophie presented his bird to him at the door with the same deliberateness she'd had with Victoria's. He looked at it. He looked at Sophie. He crouched down to her level the way he did when he was being specifically her father and not just adult in the room. You made this, he said. Yes. 8 weeks? 8 weeks. She crossed her arms. It's not perfect. Sophie. His voice was different than his ordinary voice. It's exactly right. She accepted this with a nod. Then she went inside because she had things to look at. Landon stood up. He looked at Victoria in the kitchen doorway, and she was holding her bird, and she looked back at him, and there was the house behind her and the spring yard behind him, and the morning was clear and the maple was fully green now, and nothing about this was simple, and everything about it was good. She's been planning that for 2 months, he said. I know, Victoria said. You knew? I suspected. She asked me in February what my favorite kind of bird was. He stared at her. You didn't tell me. She made you one too, Victoria said. It worked out. He looked at the bird in his hand. He looked at Victoria. He shook his head, which meant he was done arguing with the situation, and came up the porch steps, and she stepped back to let him in, and he paused in the doorway, and she looked at him. He kissed her. Not the first time exactly. There had been a Thursday in March in the kitchen that had been the actual first time, quiet and uncomplicated and long overdue. But the particular quality of this one was different. It was a morning in April with Sophie inside looking at the mantelpiece in the yard in full spring, and 2 hand-carved birds, one in each of their hands, made by a 9-year-old who had decided without being asked that they went together. She had built her company at 26 with 30,000 borrowed dollars. She had taken a mid-sized firm and made it into something that mattered. She had survived 4 years of a marriage that looked right and felt like absence. She had bought a house nobody else would have bought and made it into a home. She had been targeted and had held her ground and had not bent. She had done all of that alone, which was true, and also not entirely the point. The point was this: the house on Maplewood Lane had been waiting to be itself. The renovation had not changed it into something else. It had uncovered what was already there, under the wrong repairs and the years of neglect and the accumulated wrong decisions of people who hadn't known what they had. She thought that was probably true about more than houses. She thought about 2 women in a photograph laughing at something a camera caught the edge of, standing in front of a building that didn't have walls yet. She thought about a dream that had been separated and scattered and that had arrived here, in the hands of their children, not as the inn they'd planned, but as something else, something neither of them had blueprints for. She thought about how you couldn't plan your way into everything that mattered. She thought about buying a house because it felt right when nothing else was looking right. She thought about trusting the thing that was bothering you. She thought about a girl at a kitchen table who had looked at a photograph of 2 strangers and said, "So you were kind of supposed to meet," and had then gone back to her crackers without needing to be told she was right. Landon stepped back. Sophie appeared in the doorway behind them. She looked at them. She looked at the birds. She looked at the yard. "The tree is really green," she said. "It is," Victoria said. "Better than winter." "Different," Victoria said. "I liked winter too." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I like it better when it's both," she said, "when you can remember the other one." Victoria looked at her. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it standing in the doorway of the house on Maplewood Lane with the April morning around her and Landon beside her and Sophie in the doorframe looking at the green maple with the gray eyes that went straight through things. She thought about it while they went inside for the breakfast she had already made. Correctly this time. The eggs exactly right. Nobody mentioning the improvement because they were too busy eating. She thought about it while Sophie read the next chapter of her book in the living room, and Landon looked at the mantelpiece the way he sometimes did, the assessing look of a craftsman checking his own work. And then he looked at her, and she looked back, and there was nothing to manage and nothing to protect and nothing to be careful about. Just the morning. Just this. She had not been looking for a family. But here was the thing about the things you weren't looking for. Sometimes they were the only things that came without the weight of all your expectations. Sometimes they arrived the way that house had arrived. Imperfect, slightly sagging on one side, smelling like old wood, and needing someone to see it right. And sometimes what you built in the finding of it held better than anything you'd ever planned. The maple was very green. The house on Maplewood Lane stood solid and warm in the spring morning. And all 3 of them were, for the first time in a long time, exactly where they were supposed to be.